Chapter 1. The Awakening Storm. The first warning came not as sound or sight, but as a tremor in the very fabric of reality itself. Lord Commander Robert Guilliman stood in the strategium of the Macragge's honor, his enhanced senses detecting what lesser minds could not. A disturbance in the warp that made his gene-enhanced biology recoil in instinctive alarm. For 50 years since his resurrection, he had grown accustomed to the background noise of the Great Rift's psychic emanations. But this was different. This was personal. "My lord?" Captain Sicarius stepped forward, noting his Primarch's sudden stillness. "The astropathic choirs report." Silence. Guilliman's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Around them, the bridge crew continued their duties in hushed reverence, but the Primarch's attention was focused entirely inward, on a presence pressing against his consciousness with frightening familiarity. Across the galaxy, on the throne world of Terra itself, the Astronomicon flickered. For the briefest of moments, perhaps a heartbeat, perhaps an eternity, the psychic lighthouse that guided humanity through the warp dimmed. 10,000 astropaths screamed in unison as something vast and terrible stirred within the Emperor's presence, something that had slumbered for 10 millennia, but now clawed its way toward wakefulness. In the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, seals that had remained inviolate since the Horus heresy began to crack, ancient wards, powered by the Emperor's will and maintained by the Custodian Guard, sparked and hissed as energies beyond mortal comprehension pressed against their boundaries. Captain General Trajan Valoris felt the disturbance through his enhanced senses, and immediately voxed emergency protocols to every custodian detachment across Terra. But the epicenter of the phenomenon lay deeper still, in the throne room itself. The Emperor's psychic scream tore through dimensions, a clarion call that reached not just across space, but through time itself. It touched worlds that no longer existed, times that had passed into legend, and souls that had been thought lost forever. Within that terrible cry was a single, overwhelming imperative. Return. On Nocturne, Vulcan's body convulsed. The Promethean Lord had been dead for 3 standard years, his perpetual nature finally exhausted after millennia of resurrections. The salamanders had built a shrine around his body, maintaining eternal vigil, as their tome of fire proclaimed they must. But as the Emperor's call echoed through the warp, cellular regeneration began anew. Flesh knitted itself together, organs reformed, and consciousness sparked back into existence, like a forge fire suddenly fed oxygen. Brother Captain Tushan was the first to witness the miracle. He had been maintaining his vigil when the body on the obsidian slab suddenly drew breath. Eyes like molten gold opened, and Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders, sat up as though awakening from a simple nap rather than death itself. "Father calls," Vulcan rumbled, his voice carrying the resonance of tectonic shifts. "My brothers stir." In the Imperium Nihilus, Lionel Jonsson ceased his war council mid-sentence. The Lord of Caliban had been coordinating the defense of 3 sectors against a chaos incursion when the psychic wave struck him like a physical blow. For a moment that stretched into subjective hours, his consciousness was elsewhere, standing in a vast throne room, surrounded by figures he had not seen for 10,000 years. "My lord." Luther's voice seemed to come from very far away, though his seneschal stood mere paces from the tactical display. The Lion second in command had long since earned redemption in the Primarch's eyes, but even he could not penetrate the trance that held his master. The Lion saw them all. Guilliman's steady presence, strong and familiar. Vulcan's steady warmth, so recently returned from death's embrace. Others, more distant but growing stronger. Russ, wild and untamed somewhere in the eye of terror. Khan, racing through webway passages on some eternal hunt. Korax, a shadow flickering between worlds. And beneath it all, something else. Something impossible. Horus. The name formed unbidden in his mind, carrying with it a mixture of love, betrayal, and hope so complex it threatened to overwhelm his enhanced psyche. But the presence was real, cleansed somehow of the taint that had consumed the War Master, restored to what he had been before chaos claimed him. "Prep the fleet," the Lion commanded, his voice carrying an urgency that made his officers scramble to comply. "We depart for Terra immediately." But the psychic storm was not limited to the Loyalist sons. In the warp, where reality bent to will and nightmare, the demon Primarchs felt their father's call as a burning brand pressed against their souls. Magnus the Red paused in his studies of forbidden lore, his single eye widening as the implications struck him. Mortarian's concentration broke, allowing precious seconds for Imperial defenders to rally against his latest plague assault. Even Angron, lost in eternal fury, felt the pull like a chain around his neck. Familiar, hated, but undeniably real. "He calls to us," Fulgrim whispered from his palace of sensation, perfect features twisted in an expression of hunger and longing. After all this time, Father calls to his children. The 4 demon princes found themselves drawn together through the warp's twisted geography, their essences manifesting in a space that was neither fully real nor entirely imaginary. Around them swirled the colors of their patron gods: pink fire, green plague light, brass rage, and purple excess. But something greater held them in conference. "This changes everything," Magnus stated, his scholarly mind already calculating possibilities. "If the loyal dogs are stirring, if Father truly seeks to gather his sons once more, then we finish what we started at Terra," Mortarion rasped, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of bitterness. "No more half measures, no more games. We end this." Angron's response was wordless rage, but it carried agreement. Fulgrim merely smiled, beautiful and terrible. Across the Imperium, astropaths died in droves as messages flooded the psychic networks. On 1,000 worlds, Imperial commanders received the same garbled transmissions. The Primarchs were returning. Space Marine chapters felt the stirring in their gene seed, a resonance that spoke of their primogenitors awakening. The Blood Angels wept without understanding why. The Iron Hands felt their mechanical augmentations hum with new purpose. The Space Wolves howled at stars that held no moons. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, ancient mechanisms that had not stirred since the heresy began to activate. Cogitators bearing the personal seal of the Emperor himself came online, running programs that Malkador the Sigillite had written in anticipation of this day. Throughout Terra's hive cities, Arbites precincts received sealed orders that had waited 10 millennia for activation. The Inquisition's most secret vaults opened, revealing weapons and artifacts prepared for an eventuality most had thought would never come. And in the throne room itself, where the master of mankind sat in eternal vigil, golden features that had remained impassive for 10,000 years shifted almost imperceptibly. If any had been present to witness it, if any could have survived the psychic pressure of being in that sacred space, they might have sworn they saw the Emperor's lips move, forming words that echoed across space and time. "Come home, my sons. All of you. Come home." The storm was beginning, and when it passed, the galaxy would never be the same. From his command bridge, Guilliman felt the last echoes of the psychic phenomenon fade, leaving him with absolute certainty of 2 things. His brothers were awakening across the galaxy, and the final war for humanity's soul was about to begin. For the first time in 50 years of constant battle and administration, the Lord Commander of the Imperium smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. The 13th Legion would be ready. Chapter 2. Brothers Lost and Found. The Eye of Terror writhed with unnatural fury as reality bent to accommodate the impossible. Layman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, materialized on the bridge of his flagship with the suddenness of lightning striking bone-dry tinder. For 10,000 years he had hunted through the Eye's twisted realms, pursuing the cure for his brother's curse, growing ever more feral with each passing century. But the Emperor's call had torn through even the warp's chaotic embrace, yanking him back to real space with violent certainty. The Wolf King's appearance had changed. His great mane of hair, once golden as Fenrisian wheat, now bore streaks of silver that seemed to move with their own light. Scars that had not been there before marked his flesh, wounds that spoke of battles against things that should not exist. Most disturbing of all were his eyes. They held depths that no mortal gaze was meant to perceive, as though he had looked upon the fundamental machinery of chaos itself and somehow retained his sanity. "Jarl Grimnar," he growled, his voice carrying harmonics that made nearby space wolves instinctively bare their fangs. "How long?" The great wolf of Fenris dropped to one knee, his weathered features showing a mixture of joy and terror. "My king, you have been gone for 10 millennia, 3 centuries, 17 years, 42 days. Russ's voice carried certainty born of perfect memory. I felt every moment pass while I walked the paths between nightmares. But that is done now. Father calls, and the wolf answers. He paused, nostrils flaring as he scented something in the recycled air of the ship. Gilliman lives. The lion has returned. And others. Others I thought lost forever stir once more. Orders flooded the Fenrisian communication networks within moments. Every great company, every wolf guard, every bloodclaw felt it. Their gene sire had returned, and the time of endings was at hand. Meanwhile, in a dimension that existed parallel to reality, but followed none of its rules, Jagatai Khan burst from the webway in a spray of crystallized time. The master of the White Scars had spent the last 10 millennia racing through the Eldar's network of passages, pursuing Dark Eldar raiders who had dared strike at Chogoris. But his hunt had taken him deeper into the webway than any human was meant to travel, to places where the barriers between dimensions grew thin and the ancient Eldar's greatest fears took shape. He had learned much in that time. Too much. The Khan's bike, a fusion of Imperial technology and webway crystal, screamed as it rematerialized in the void above Chogoris. Around him, his honor guard, the few who had survived the decade-spanning hunt, emerged from tears in space itself. They had been changed by their journey, their armor bearing inscriptions in languages that predated humanity, their weapons humming with energies that the Mechanicus would declare heretical. "My Khan!" Brother Kinsar voxed, his voice tight with relief and something approaching terror. "The auguries showed. I know what they showed," Jagatai interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "I have seen the Golden Path's destination, Ja. I have witnessed what our father plans and the price that must be paid." He paused, looking down at Chogoris with eyes that had seen the birth and death of civilizations. "But that is a burden for another day. Today, we ride for terror." The White Scars monastery ship received the Khan's return with engines already firing. They had felt his approach through the great ocean itself, a sensation like thunder rolling across infinite steppes. Within hours, the entire chapter was mobilizing for a journey that would take them to the very heart of the Imperium. In the deepest reaches of the Eye of Terror, where the warp's currents carried echoes of every atrocity ever committed, Corvus Corax ceased his eternal hunt. For 10,000 years, the Raven Lord had stalked through shadow and flame, pursuing Lorgar and his word-bearers through nightmares given form. He had become something more than Astartes, more than Primarch, a living shadow that could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, a creature of vengeance that even demons feared to name. But the Emperor's call cut through even his transformed essence, and for the first time in millennia, Corvus Corax remembered what it was to feel hope. He manifested aboard the Raven Spire as though he had always been there, his form shifting between solid flesh and writhing shadow. The Raven Guard who witnessed his return fell to their knees, some weeping openly at the sight of their gene-sire. Others seemed unable to perceive him directly, seeing only movement at the corner of their vision. Chapter Master Shrike, Corax spoke, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My sons, I have learned much in my exile, seen the true face of our enemies. But that knowledge must wait. He paused, his form solidifying as he focused his will. Prepare the chapter for war. Not the skirmishes you have fought in my absence, but war as it was meant to be waged. The heresy never ended, Kayvan. It merely waited. The Vox networks of the Imperium crackled with emergency transmissions as 3 legendary chapters prepared to move simultaneously. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. On Terra, in the fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists, Brother Captain Lysander stood before a vault that had remained sealed since the Iron Cage incident 10 millennia ago. For 5 decades, he had felt the pull of this place growing stronger, as though something within called to him across the centuries. Today, that call had become impossible to ignore. The vault's locks disengaged with a hiss of stale air. Inside, on a simple adamantium bier, lay Rogel Dawn, not dead, but suspended in the deepest form of Astartes' hibernation. His body bore wounds that would have killed any other being, massive trauma to the torso, burns that spoke of weapons that should not exist, and most notably, his left hand was indeed missing, severed cleanly at the wrist. But he lived. His twin hearts beat with steady rhythm. His enhanced physiology had sustained him through 10,000 years of healing sleep, waiting for the moment when he would be needed most. As Lysander and his honor guard entered the vault, Dawn's eyes opened. They were the same iron-grey they had always been, but now they held depths forged by suffering and an understanding of sacrifice that went beyond anything he had known before. "Lysander," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse, but carrying absolute authority. "How fares the Imperium?" "It endures, my lord," Lysander replied, struggling to maintain his composure. "As you taught us it must." Dawn sat up slowly, examining his missing hand with clinical detachment. "Good. And my brothers? Lord Guilliman has led us for 50 years. The Lion has returned to aid the Imperium Nihilus. And now—" Lysander paused, still struggling with the magnitude of what was occurring. "Now they all come home." "As Father willed it," Dawn said simply. He stood, his massive frame filling the small chamber. "Then we have work to do. The palace's defenses will need to be reinforced. If all my brothers return, then the enemy will not be far behind." Across the galaxy, warp storms intensified with each passing hour. What had begun as a localized phenomenon around Terra now spread outward like ripples on a pond. But these ripples carried the weight of destiny. Ships traveling through the warp reported strange sightings, fleets of vessels that shouldn't exist, bearing heraldry not seen for 10,000 years. Some spoke of seeing the vengeful spirit itself, Horus's flagship, somehow cleansed of chaos taint and burning with golden light. On Baal, the blood angels felt a stirring in their gene seed, unlike anything since the death of Sanguinius. Chapter Master Dante, ancient beyond measure, but still bearing the weight of leadership, stood in the hall of sarcophagi, and wept as he felt something impossible approaching through the warp. A presence that felt like coming home. On Medusa, the Iron Hand's machinery hummed with new harmonics as their mechanical augmentations responded to frequencies they had never detected before. The flesh is weak, they chanted, but even their mechanical hearts quickened with anticipation. From the fortress monasteries of 1,000 chapters came the same report. Their gene seed sang with resonance. Their battle brothers experienced visions of figures thought lost forever, and their librarians spoke in tongues of a great convergence approaching. But not all the news was joyous. Long-range astropathic scrying detected massive disturbances in the Eye of Terror itself. Demon armies were marshalling on a scale not seen since the heresy, and at their head stood figures of terrible majesty, the traitor Primarchs, gathering their strength for what could only be the final war. The missing sons were coming home, but they would not arrive unopposed. The galaxy held its breath as ancient powers stirred, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of humanity itself. On Terra, in the depths of the Imperial Palace, servo skulls bearing the personal seal of Robert Guilliman carried emergency communiques to every branch of Imperial government. The message was brief, but carried the weight of absolute authority. All loyal forces are to converge on Terra with utmost speed. The Primarchs return. The final war begins now. The hunt was over. The gathering had begun. And in the space between heartbeats, between the tick of a chronometer and the next, the galaxy changed forever. Chapter 3. The Dead Rise. Death had never been absolute for the sons of the Emperor, but what occurred on Baal defied even the most generous interpretations of possibility. The Sanguinor had been restless for weeks, the golden figure appearing to blood angels across the galaxy with increasing frequency, always pointing toward their home world with silent urgency. Chapter Master Dante had dismissed it as another manifestation of the Black Rage. But as he stood in the sacred hall of sarcophagi, he realized how wrong he had been. The massive golden sarcophagus that had held Sanguinius's remains for 10 millennia began to resonate with a frequency that made every blood angel present fall to their knees. The ancient relic, crafted from auramite and blessed by the Emperor himself, pulsed with a light that seemed to emanate from within the very atoms of the metal. "Impossible," whispered Brother Corbulo, the sanguinary high priest, his ancient augmetic eyes wide with shock. "The gene template shows." He could not finish the sentence, for what his instruments detected violated every principle of biology and theology he had ever learned. Within the sarcophagus, cellular regeneration was occurring on a scale that transcended anything in Imperial records. Flesh was reforming from atomic traces, bones rebuilding from molecular fragments, and most impossible of all, a soul was returning from whatever realm claimed the truly dead. The sarcophagus lid shattered with a sound like thunder splitting the heavens. Sanguinius rose from his 10,000-year grave with wings spread wide, each feather gleaming like burnished gold. But these were not the pristine wings of legend. They bore scars that spoke of unimaginable battles, and their edges flickered with psychic energy that made reality shiver around them. The great angel's face was as beautiful as ever, but his eyes held depths of sorrow that no mortal mind was meant to comprehend. "My sons," he spoke, and every blood angel in the hall wept openly at the sound of their father's voice. I have seen the darkness beyond death, witnessed the price of failure. But I have also seen hope." He paused, studying their faces with expressions of love and infinite sadness. "The final trial approaches, and we must not falter as we did before." Commander Dante removed his golden mask with trembling hands, revealing a face marked by 1,500 years of warfare and leadership. "My lord, how? You were the War Master." Horus struck me down. "Yes, but death was merely another battlefield, my son. And our father's will reaches even there." Sanguinius stepped from the shattered sarcophagus, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to move independently. "The Emperor has need of all his sons for what comes next, even those who have already paid the ultimate price." Across the galaxy, on the forge world of Medusa, impossibility took a different form. Fabricator General Cardan Stronos felt the disturbance in the Omnissiah's will before any augury could detect it. The iron of his augmetic replacements hummed with harmonics that spoke of his Genesire's approach, but what emerged from the warp translation point defied all expectation. The ship that materialized was a fusion of Imperial technology and something else, geometries that hurt to perceive, hull plating that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and engines that burned with the cold fire of pure mathematics. At its prow stood a figure that was Ferrus Manus, but Ferrus Manus transformed. The Gorgon had returned as a being of living metal and divine flesh, his form a perfect synthesis of man and machine that would have been heretical if it had not so clearly been blessed by the Omnissiah itself. His famous liquid metal hands now extended up his arms in flowing patterns of silver and gold, and his eyes burned with the light of binary hymns given form. When he spoke, his voice carried the resonance of forge hammers and the whisper of electrons through sacred circuits. "My sons, I have walked in the realm of the machine god, learned the true meaning of the flesh's weakness and the strength's blessing. The time of preparation is over." Brother Cardan fell to his knees, his mechanical voice box struggling to process the emotional subroutines flooding his cognitive centers. "Father, the ancient prophecies spoke of the Avatar's return, but we never dared hope." "Hope is the first gift of understanding," Ferrus replied, his enhanced form stepping onto the landing platform, with movements that spoke of perfect mechanical precision, guided by divine will. "But understanding alone is insufficient. We have work to do, my sons. The galaxy's greatest forge work awaits." The Iron Hands who witnessed their Primarch's return experienced something unprecedented in their post-human existence. They felt their augmetic components harmonize with their remaining organic tissue, a sensation of perfect unity between flesh and machine that their doctrine had always promised but never delivered. Several wept coolant fluid from their optic sensors, a display of emotion that would have been inconceivable before this moment. On Mars, the Fabricator General's Emergency Council convened within nanoseconds of receiving the astropathic transmission from Medusa. The implications of Ferrus Manus's return sent shock waves through the Mechanicus hierarchy that reverberated all the way to the deepest forge vaults. The ninth prophecy of unification speaks of the Avatar's return heralding the final synthesis, intoned Tec Dominus Xenotechnos, his vox grill barely containing the excitement in his binary cant. If the Gorgon lives, if he has achieved true unity with the Omnissiah, then all our calculations must be recalibrated, finished Fabricator General Carl, his ancient consciousness already running probability matrices at the speed of thought. The Primarch's return was not in our projections. This changes everything about the long war's ultimate resolution. But not all reactions to the resurrections were joyous. In the eye of terror, the demon Primarchs felt their dead brothers return as physical blows to their transformed essence. Fulgrim screamed in his palace of sensation, perfect features contorting with rage, as he felt Ferrus Manus's presence burning like a brand across the warp. The bond between the two brothers had transcended death, and now it brought only pain as the demon prince confronted the magnitude of his ancient betrayal. "He returns to judge me," Fulgrim whispered, his voice carrying harmonics of terror that made his demon servants flee in panic. "The one soul I could never forget, the brother whose friendship I cherished above all else. He returns cleansed while I remain damned." Magnus the Red felt Sanguinius's resurrection as a psychic shock wave that disrupted his most carefully constructed spells. The great angel had always been the most psychically sensitive of the loyalist Primarchs, and his return brought with it knowledge of the Emperor's true plans that terrified even the Crimson King. "Father plays a deeper game than any of us suspected," Magnus muttered, his single eye blazing with frustrated comprehension. "If he can recall the dead, if death itself bows to his will, then perhaps our rebellion was doomed from the moment it began." On Terra, in the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, ancient machinery that had remained dormant since the heresy began to stir. The Emperor's psychic might, channeled through the restored souls of his sons, was reaching levels not seen since the height of the Great Crusade. The Golden Throne itself resonated with harmonics that made the custodians guarding it fall to their knees in reverence and terror. Captain General Trajan Valoris felt the change in his very bones. The master of mankind's presence was growing stronger, more focused, as though 10,000 years of careful preparation were finally reaching fruition. But with that growing power came a terrible certainty. The final war was not merely approaching, it was inevitable, and its outcome would determine whether humanity ascended to true immortality or fell into eternal darkness. In the strategium of the Macrage's honor, Robert Gilliman paused in his planning as he felt the psychic resonance of his brother's impossible returns. Sanguinius's noble soul, Ferrus's perfect synthesis of flesh and machine, both had been restored by their father's will. But at what cost? The Ultramarines. Primarch's enhanced intellect immediately grasped the implications. "If father can resurrect the dead," he murmured to himself, "then the stakes of what comes next are higher than I ever imagined. This is not merely a war for the galaxy's future, it is a war for the very nature of existence itself." The resurrections sent shock waves through Imperial and Chaos forces alike. On 1,000 worlds, Chaos cults felt the return of their ancient enemies and redoubled their efforts to summon demonic aid. Loyalist forces experienced unprecedented surges in morale as news of the impossible returns spread through astropathic networks. But perhaps most significantly, the resurrections marked a fundamental shift in the galaxy's metaphysical balance. Death itself had been challenged and found wanting when measured against the Emperor's will. The warp roiled with the implications as fundamental constants of reality shifted to accommodate impossibilities made manifest. Brother Corbulo, studying the genetic samples he had managed to collect during Sanguinius's resurrection, made a discovery that shook him to his enhanced core. The gene seed patterns showed not just restoration, but evolution, improvements that spoke of divine intervention at the most fundamental level. "He has not simply returned," the sanguinary high priest whispered to Commander Dante. "He has been perfected, made into something greater than he was before. And if the same is true of Lord Ferrus—" He could not finish the thought, for its implications were too vast to contemplate. The dead had risen, and with them came the promise of ultimate victory or final damnation. The galaxy held its breath as ancient powers stirred, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the very nature of reality began to change. On Baal and Medusa, two impossible figures stood reborn, their presence alone sufficient to alter the course of history itself. The final war was coming, and the dead would march alongside the living in humanity's ultimate hour. Chapter 4. Chaos Ascendant. In the realm where thought became reality and nightmare took flesh, the traitor Primarchs gathered for the first time since the failed siege of Terra, 10 millennia past. The meeting place was nowhere and everywhere, a confluence of warp currents that existed at the intersection of 4 divine domains. Here, where Tzeentch's crystal mazes met Nurgle's plague gardens, where Khorne's brass citadels bordered Slaaneish's palaces of sensation, the sons of the Emperor who had chosen damnation convened in council of war. Magnus the Red materialized first, his cyclopean form wreathed in eldritch fires that burned without consuming. The Crimson King's single eye blazed with fury as he felt the psychic resonance of his loyalist brother's impossible returns echoing across dimensions. For 10,000 years he had brooded on Prospero's destruction, nursing his hatred of Leman Russ and the Corpse Emperor's hypocrisy. But now, with Sanguinius and Ferrus Manus restored from death itself, the very foundations of his understanding trembled. "Father plays games beyond our comprehension," Magnus spoke to the writhing void, his voice carrying harmonics that made reality bleed at the edges. "If he can recall the dead, what else has the anathema hidden from us?" Mortarion came next, his plague-ridden form materializing through clouds of toxic vapor that would have scoured the life from entire worlds. The Death Lord's scythe silence dripped with diseases that had yet to evolve, and his ancient power armor wept perpetual tears of corruption. The Lord of Barbarous had spent centuries perfecting new strains of spiritual and physical plague, but news of his brother's resurrection had driven him to fury that transcended his usual methodical patience. "The false emperor mocks us," Mortarion rasped, his voice carrying the weight of 10 billion deaths. "He shows us what we can never have: redemption, resurrection, the love of our gene sons. But we are beyond such weaknesses now. We are perfection through decay, strength through acceptance of entropy's truth." Angron's arrival shattered the carefully constructed meeting space, his presence so violent that the warp itself recoiled. The Red Angel manifested as a titan of brass and blood, his wings casting shadows that screamed with the voices of the slain. Khorne's blessing had transformed him into living fury given form, but beneath the demon's rage, the broken Primarch's soul still remembered what it was to have brothers who loved him. His response was wordless, a roar that shattered reality across 3 dimensions and sent shockwaves through the Imperium that would be felt as seismic disturbances across a dozen worlds. When the echo faded, his meaning was clear. Rage beyond measure, fury that demanded the complete destruction of everything that had made him what he was. Fulgrim arrived with characteristic grace, his serpentine form a fusion of terrible beauty and absolute corruption. The Phoenician's 4 arms moved in impossible harmonies, each gesture creating waves of sensation that would drive mortals mad with desire. Of all the fallen Primarchs, he had changed the most, embracing Slaaneish's gifts with an enthusiasm that horrified even his corrupted brothers. "My dear siblings," Fulgrim purred, his voice carrying undertones of pleasure and pain intertwined. "How long has it been since we last spoke as family? 10,000 years of glorious damnation, and now Father calls his lost children home. But some of us have found new families, haven't we?" The 4 demon princes circled each other in the space between thoughts, their combined presence causing reality to buckle and fold. Each represented the pinnacle of their patron god's power, but they were still, fundamentally, brothers. That bond, twisted and corrupted though it had become, remained unbroken. Guilliman stands ascendant, Magnus stated, his sorcerous sight penetrating veils of space and time. The lion prowls his domain in the dark. Vulcan burns with perpetual fire, and Dawn rebuilds his walls. Rus howls from his hunt. Khan rides the stellar winds, and Korak stalks between shadows. He paused, his single eye blazing brighter. And now the angel and the Gorgon walk among the living once more, restored by Father's will. 8 loyalist dogs, Mortarion calculated, his diseased mind already formulating strategies of contamination and decay. Against 4 demon princes, and whoever else still serves the true gods, the mathematics appear unfavorable. Mathematics mean nothing when rage is infinite, Angron snarled, his voice like continents grinding against each other. Let them come. Let them all come. Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows. But before any could respond, the space around them shuddered as 2 more presences manifested. Primarchs who had remained in self-imposed exile since the heresy's end, but who could no longer ignore the call of destiny. Perturabo emerged from geometries that hurt to perceive, his form a fusion of demon flesh and impossible machinery. The Iron Warrior had spent 10 millennia in the Eye of Terror, constructing fortresses that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and perfecting siege engines that could crack reality itself. His fortress world of Medrengard had become a nexus of industrial malevolence, but even its master could not ignore what was transpiring. "Brothers!" Perturabo spoke, his voice carrying the resonance of grinding gears and collapsing structures. I felt the tremor across all dimensions. Father gathers his loyalist sons for one final war, does he not? Lorgar Aurelian manifested last, his presence bringing with it the weight of absolute faith perverted into its darkest form. The word-bearer had become something beyond even the other demon princes, a living embodiment of chaos undivided, a being whose very existence proved the truth of the primordial annihilator's supremacy. His arrival caused the other Primarchs to involuntarily kneel as the sheer force of his corrupted divinity pressed against their consciousness. "My beloved brothers," Lorgar spoke, his voice carrying harmonics of prayer and blasphemy intertwined. "The moment I prophesied during the heresy has finally arrived. Father reveals his true power, and we must answer in kind. The long war ends now, not with gradual corruption, but with absolute victory or ultimate defeat." The 6 Daemon princes formed a circle in the impossible space, their combined presence causing warp storms to erupt across the galaxy. Each represented the apex of their patron god's power, but together they were something more, a concentration of malevolent divinity that had not existed since the heresy itself. "The question," Magnus said, his sorcerous intellect already calculating possibilities, "is coordination. We have spent 10 millennia pursuing our own agendas, fighting separate wars. If we are to face 8 loyalist Primarchs and the full might of the Emperor's restored power—" "We divide the galaxy between us," Perturabo interrupted, his strategic mind already envisioning the campaign. "Each takes a sector, claims it absolutely. Then we converge on Terra from all directions, simultaneously. No more individual raids, no more gradual corruption. Total war on all fronts." "Khorne claims the ultima segmentum," Angron declared, his brass wings spreading wide. "Let me face Guilliman and his perfect little empire. I will paint it red with the blood of the faithful. The solar segmentum shall burn with plague," Mortarion added, his scythe weeping diseases that had yet to evolve. Let me bring Father's gift of entropy to the very heart of his domain. I claim segmentum pacificus, Fulgrim purred, his serpentine form coiling with anticipation. So many worlds, so many souls to perfect through sensation and pain. Segmentum obscurus belongs to me, Magnus declared, his single eye blazing with eldritch fire. Let me shatter the barriers between reality and unreality, show them the true futility of their corpse god's protection. Perturabo studied the galactic projections his enhanced mind constructed. Segmentum Tempestus contains some of our finest strongholds. I shall coordinate from there, ensure our forces move as one great machine of destruction. And I, Lorgar said, his presence making reality itself genuflect, shall strike at the heart of their faith. Terror itself shall know the true meaning of divine revelation. But even as they planned, a seventh presence made itself known, not through manifestation, but through the sudden appearance of space marines bearing the Hydra-scale iconography of the Alpha Legion. They materialized without warning, their presence suggesting capabilities that even demon princes found impressive. Alfarius lives, their leader spoke, removing his helmet to reveal features that might have belonged to the lost Primarch, or might have been those of any Alpha Legionnaire trained to perfection. Or perhaps Omegon speaks through me. Does it matter? The Hydra has many heads, and all serve the same purpose. And that purpose is? Fulgrim asked, his perfect features showing genuine curiosity. Victory, the Alpha Legion commander replied simply. We have spent 10 millennia infiltrating every level of Imperial society, preparing for this moment. While you waged war in the warp, we fought the long war in the shadows of reality. The Imperium's infrastructure, its communication networks, its supply lines, all are compromised. When you move, we shall ensure their responses are inadequate. The implications struck each demon Primarch simultaneously. They had always viewed the Alpha Legion as an enigma, uncertain whether their ultimate loyalty lay with chaos or with some deeper purpose. But if the 20th Legion had truly spent 10 millennia preparing for this moment, across the galaxy, the preparations began. Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos for 10,000 years, felt the shift in the warp's currents and knew his time as Supreme Commander was ending. The demon Primarchs moved with authority that transcended even his legendary status, and the traitor legions responded to their gene sire's calls with loyalty that made his own achievements seem pale by comparison. On Sycharis, the word-bearers ceased their endless liturgies and began preparing for holy war on a scale that would eclipse even the heresy itself. On Medrengard, Perturabo's war machines ground to life, producing weapons that existed partially in the warp and could therefore strike targets across dimensional barriers. The Iron Warriors' fleets began mustering for the first time since the Iron Cage, their battle barges and siege engines preparing for warfare that would reshape the galaxy. In the Eye of Terror, the World Eaters felt their Primarch's rage calling to them across space and time. Berserkers who had known nothing but endless slaughter for millennia suddenly found focus, a target worthy of their infinite fury. The Thousand Suns felt Magnus's psychic summons resonating through their warp-touched souls, while the Emperor's children abandoned their pleasure pursuits to answer Fulgrim's call for perfect war. The Death Guard emerged from their plague ships with renewed purpose, their diseased forms animated by Mortarion's vision of imperial worlds, choking on spiritual and physical corruption. Across the galaxy, chaos cults that had waited generations for this moment began activating, their members dying in ecstatic sacrifice to fuel rituals that would tear holes in reality itself. But perhaps most ominously, reports began filtering through Imperial intelligence networks of Alpha Legion cells, revealing themselves across 1,000 worlds. Governors who had served loyally for decades suddenly declared for chaos. Imperial Navy officers opened fire on their own ships. Astropathic choirs began transmitting coordinates of Imperial strongholds directly to Chaos fleets. The Hydra had revealed its many heads, and each one bore poison that would corrupt the Imperium from within. On Terra, in the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, emergency protocols that had remained dormant since the heresy began activating. The Master of Mankind's psychic might, channeled through his returned sons, was growing to match the threat that approached. But even the Emperor's vast intellect struggled to comprehend the scale of coordination his fallen sons had achieved. The final war was beginning, and this time, chaos came not as a serpent in the garden, but as a storm that would engulf all reality. The galaxy burned, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, 10,000 years of careful preparation reached fruition. The traitor Primarchs had returned to finish what they started, and this time they would not be denied. Chapter 5. The Emperor's Gambit. The throne room of the Imperial Palace had not seen a living soul in 10,000 years, save for the golden sentinels who stood eternal vigil over their dying god. But as Robut Guilliman approached the massive adamantine doors, each step echoing through corridors that had witnessed the birth and death of empires, he felt a presence stirring that made his enhanced physiology recoil in awe and terror. The custodian guard flanked him as he walked, their auramite armor gleaming in the sepulchral light of ancient lumens. Captain General Trajan Valoris had personally escorted the Lord Commander of the Imperium, his enhanced features betraying none of the anticipation that radiated from his being. For 50 years, Guilliman had ruled in his father's name, but he had not spoken directly with the Master of Mankind since his resurrection. Today, that would change. The throne room doors opened without sound, revealing the vast cathedral space beyond. At its heart sat the golden throne, that terrible fusion of archaeotech and human will that had sustained the Emperor's barely living form for 10 millennia. But as Guilliman entered, he realized something fundamental had changed. The Emperor's psychic presence, usually carefully contained to prevent it from overwhelming mortal minds, blazed forth with intensity that made reality itself bend around its focus. Golden light streamed from the Master of Mankind's form, not the pale radiance of barely contained life, but the brilliant illumination of a god preparing to act. "My son." The voice spoke directly into Guilliman's consciousness, bypassing his ears entirely. It carried weight that threatened to crush his enhanced psyche, but also warmth that reminded him of distant days when he had known the love of a true father. "Father," Guilliman spoke aloud, his voice barely a whisper in the vast space. You planned this. All of it. The resurrections, the returns. You foresaw this moment." "I have foreseen many moments, Robut. 10,000 years upon this throne have given me perspectives that transcend linear time. I saw the moment Horus would fall to chaos, the instant Sanguinius would sacrifice himself, the hour when Ferrus would meet his doom. But I also saw beyond those failures to the moment when all could be made whole again. The Emperor's psychic projection began to manifest, his towering form materializing in golden radiance that made the throne room's ancient stones sing with harmonics of power. He stood now as Guilliman remembered him from the Great Crusade, magnificent, terrible, and absolutely certain of his purpose. "The cost," Guilliman said, his tactical mind already calculating the implications. Resurrecting the dead, calling back the lost. What price have you paid for this power? The same price I have always paid, my son. Everything. The Emperor gestured to the golden throne, its mechanisms glowing with energies that hurt to perceive. For 10 millennia, I have fed this device not just my life force, but every fragment of humanity's collective faith, every prayer offered in my name, every sacrifice made in the Imperium's defense. All of it channeled, focused, accumulated for this single moment. Behind the throne, hidden mechanisms that had remained dormant since the heresy began to activate. The Throne of Bones, a secondary system that Malcador the Sigillite had constructed in secret, emerged from concealed alcoves. Thousands of psychic conductive skulls, volunteers from the most faithful servants of the Imperium, began to glow with eldritch energy as they took upon themselves a portion of the Emperor's burden. You're distributing the psychic load, Guilliman realized, his enhanced intellect grasping the implications immediately. Using the faith of the dead to sustain your manifestation while maintaining the Astronomicon and the barrier against chaos. Faith is the strongest force in the universe, Robute, stronger than gravity, more fundamental than the nuclear forces. For 10,000 years, humanity has believed in the Emperor of mankind, and that belief has become reality. Now I use that reality to reshape the very nature of existence itself. The Emperor's projection moved closer, and Guilliman felt the weight of absolute attention focused upon him. But this is only the beginning. My fallen sons move against us with unity and purpose they haven't shown since the heresy. They command forces that could crack reality itself, and they are coming here, to Terra, for the final confrontation. Then we prepare for siege, Guilliman said, his strategic mind already formulating defensive plans. The palace's defenses, the solar system's fleets. No, my son. This will not be a siege. The Emperor's presence carried certainty that brooked no argument. This will be a convergence. All my sons, loyal and traitor, will gather here for the final war. And when they do, I will offer each of them one last choice: redemption or annihilation. The implications struck Guilliman like a physical blow. You mean to redeem the traitors? After everything they've done, after 10,000 years of war and suffering? I mean to give them the opportunity for redemption. What they choose to do with that opportunity will determine not just their fate, but the fate of the galaxy itself. The Emperor paused, his golden gaze seeming to pierce through time and space. Some will choose redemption. Others are too far gone, too consumed by the powers they serve. Those will find only annihilation. Across Terra, emergency Vox transmissions crackled to life as the Adeptus Custodes mobilized with efficiency that had not been seen since the heresy itself. Captain General Valoris's orders were brief but comprehensive. Every custodian guard across the galaxy was to return to Terra immediately. The Emperor's personal army, the 10,000 who had guarded him through the darkest hours, would stand ready for the final war. Sister Superior Alea of the Sisters of Silence felt the psychic summons like a clarion call that transcended her null field. The Anathema Psychana had spent 10 millennia in exile, their orders disbanded and their purpose questioned. But now, as the Emperor's power grew and psychic storms raged across the galaxy, their unique gifts were needed more than ever. Across a dozen worlds, the Sisters of Silence received the same message. Come home. The Silent Sisterhood would stand with the Emperor once more. In the Senatorum Imperialis, the the news of the Emperor's manifest presence sent shockwaves through the bureaucratic machinery that had governed humanity in his absence. Some high lords prostrated themselves in religious ecstasy, finally witnessing proof of their god's continued existence. Others recoiled in terror as they realized their centuries of political maneuvering would now be subject to divine scrutiny. Lord Commander Militant of the Astra Militarum, Cassius Vorlon felt his Voxcaster activate with priority codes that had not been used for 10,000 years. The message was simple, but carried the authority of the throne itself. Mobilize every regiment, every ship, every weapon in the Imperial arsenal. The final war was coming, and humanity would meet it with everything they possessed. High Admiral Spire of Battlefleet Solar received similar orders, his strategic displays suddenly updating with deployment patterns that seemed to come from the palace's most ancient cogitators. Ships that had been mothballed for millennia received reactor restart sequences, while dockyards that had been abandoned began showing signs of impossible activity. But not all reactions were supportive. In the depths of the Adeptus Administratum, certain high lords who had grown comfortable with their power began making discreet inquiries about the constitutional implications of the Emperor's direct rule. Whispered conversations in shadowed alcoves spoke of dangerous precedents and the need for institutional stability. Lord High Admiral Zyth found himself at the center of such conversations. For 3 centuries, he had ruled the Imperial Navy through careful political maneuvering, treating the Emperor as a distant figurehead rather than an active ruler. The prospect of divine micromanagement of his domain filled him with dread. "We must consider the implications," he whispered to Ecclesiarch Deasis VII in one of the palace's forgotten side chambers. "If the Emperor truly walks among us again, what becomes of the institutions that have governed in his absence? What becomes of us?" Such treasonous thoughts might once have gone unnoticed in the vast bureaucracy of the Imperium, but the Emperor's enhanced awareness detected every whisper of dissent. Golden light flickered in the corners of rooms where such conversations took place, a silent warning that nothing escaped divine attention. "My son's approach," the Emperor told Guilliman, his presence growing stronger with each passing moment. Vulcan burns his way across the void aboard the Salamander's flagship. Sanguinius spreads his wings above Bael's crimson skies, while his sons weep with joy. Ferrus Manus walks among his iron hands, showing them the true meaning of the flesh's weakness and the strength's blessing. Even now, Leman Russ howls his way through the warp, trailing the scent of his hunt across light years. "And the others?" Guilliman asked, though he already knew the answer. Corax moves through shadows between dimensions, his enhanced nature allowing him to travel faster than any ship. Lionel Johnson cuts his way through the Imperium Nihilus, his fleets gathering strength with each system they liberate. Even Rogel Dawn stirs from his fortress monastery, preparing defenses that will make the siege of Terra seem like a skirmish. The Emperor paused, his attention turning inward for a moment. "And Horus comes home, my son, purged of chaos taint, but carrying the weight of 10,000 years of guilt. His will be the most crucial choice of all." "Father," Guilliman said, his voice carrying uncertainty that he rarely allowed himself to show. "Are you certain this is the only way? The cost, if you're wrong, if the traitors cannot be redeemed, then I will unmake them so completely that even the Chaos Gods will forget they ever existed." The Emperor's presence carried absolute certainty. "But I must try, Robout. They are my sons, just as you are my son. Even in their damnation, even after 10,000 years of hatred and warfare, they remain part of me. To destroy them without offering redemption would be to destroy a part of myself. As if summoned by their father's words, astropathic communications began flooding Terra's reception centers. The loyal Primarchs were indeed approaching, their fleets creating warp disturbances that registered across multiple sectors. Each carried with them not just their personal forces, but the accumulated might of their Legion's successors, Space Marine chapters that had waited 10 millennia to stand beside their gene sires. The Blood Angels came in crimson glory, their red ships bearing the accumulated grief and rage of every battle fought in Sanguinius's name. The Iron Hands approached with mathematical precision, their black vessels modified with technologies that seemed to exist partially in the warp itself. The Space Wolves howled across the void in ships decorated with the bones of monsters that should not exist. From the Imperium, Nihilus came the Dark Angels, their fortress monasteries serving as mobile battle stations, while their Primarch's fury burned like a green star at their head. Behind them came the scattered forces of the Unforgiven, finally united under their gene sire's direct command. But perhaps most moving of all was the sight that greeted astropathic scryers when they turned their sight toward Nocturne. Vulcan's approach was heralded not by ships alone, but by the spontaneous activation of every Prometheum refinery, every forge, every salamander's scale across the galaxy. The Primarch of the 18th Legion came bearing gifts, weapons and armor, forged with techniques that transcended mortal understanding, tools that would be needed for the war to come. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, ancient vaults that had remained sealed since the heresy began opening, weapons that the Emperor himself had crafted during the Dark Age of technology were brought forth, their power sources still functioning after 25,000 years. Armor sets that had been worn by the Primarchs themselves during the Great Crusade emerged from stasis fields, waiting for their rightful owners to claim them once more. The Custodian Guard worked with efficiency, born of 10,000 years of preparation, their movements coordinated by tactical doctrines that had been refined across centuries. Every approach to Terra was fortified, every possible landing site prepared for defense or welcome, depending on which forces arrived. But the greatest preparation was psychological. Across Terra, across the Sol system, across the Imperium itself, word spread that the Emperor walked among humanity once more. On a billion worlds, prayers that had been rote repetitions for millennia suddenly carried new weight as the faithful realized their God was truly listening. "The stage is set, my son," the Emperor told Guilliman, as the throne room's ancient mechanisms hummed with barely contained power. "My loyal sons come home, my fallen sons prepare for war, and I prepare to offer them all one final chance at redemption. What happens next will determine whether humanity ascends to its true destiny or falls into eternal darkness." "And if they refuse redemption?" Guilliman asked, though he feared the answer. "Then I will show them why I am called the Master of Mankind," the Emperor replied, his presence blazing with power that made the palace's foundations tremble. "And this time, my mercy will not stay my hand." The gambit was in motion, the pieces arranged across the galactic board. Soon, all the Emperor's sons would stand before him once more, and the final choice between salvation and damnation would be made. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, 10,000 years of preparation reached culmination, and the galaxy held its breath for the storm to come. Chapter 6. Fractured Loyalty. The great council chamber beneath the Imperial Palace had not hosted such a gathering since the Council of Nicaea, 10 millennia past. But where that ancient assembly had been marked by ceremony and the illusion of unity, This meeting crackled with tensions that threatened to tear apart the very foundations of Imperial loyalty. 8 Primarchs stood around the massive adamantine table, their combined presence generating psychic pressure that made the chamber's ancient stones sing with harmonics of barely restrained power. Each was a demigod in their own right, a being of such magnitude that entire sectors of space bent to their will. Together, in this confined space, they were a force that could reshape reality itself, if they could agree on anything. Robert Guilliman stood at the head of the table, his position as Lord Commander of the Imperium giving him precedence, but his authority was no longer unquestioned. 50 years of rule had changed him, hardened him in ways that went beyond the physical modifications of his resurrection. The Ultramarines Primarch, who had once believed in noble ideals and perfect governance, now bore the weight of compromise and pragmatic necessity. "The Imperium endures," Guilliman began, his voice carrying the resonance of absolute authority. "For 50 years we have held back the tide of chaos, reclaimed lost worlds, and brought stability to a galaxy on the brink of collapse. The Indomitus Crusade succeeded where—" "Where what, Robout?" Leman Russ interrupted, his voice carrying the growl of Fenrisian winter storms. The Wolf King had arrived on Terra 3 days prior, his ships bearing the scent of impossible hunts, and his warriors changed by their decade-spanning journey through the Eye of Terror. Where our father's original vision failed, where the Great Crusade itself proved insufficient. Russ's amber eyes burned with fury that went beyond the physical, a rage tempered by 10,000 years of hunting through nightmares, but never cooled. "You speak of stability, brother, but I have walked through the ruins of Prospero. Not the world Magnus destroyed, but the new Prospero he has built in the Eye. I have seen what our enemies have become, while you played at being a politician." "I have governed," Guilliman replied, his tactical mind already calculating the political implications of this confrontation. "I have made the hard choices necessary to preserve humanity, while you chased phantoms through the warp." The temperature in the chamber dropped noticeably as the 2 Primarchs faced each other across the table. Around them, their honor guards tensed, hands moving unconsciously to weapon hilts, despite the absolute prohibition on violence in this sacred space. Lionel Johnson spoke into the growing tension, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of self-imposed exile. "Both of you speak truth, but neither addresses the fundamental question." The Lord of Caliban's green-eyed gaze swept across his brothers with the intensity of a predator evaluating threats. "Father's new plan requires us to trust in methods that would have been considered heretical during the Crusade. He speaks of redeeming the traitors, of offering mercy to those who have spent 10 millennia in service to our greatest enemies." "You question our father's wisdom?" Sanguinius asked, his perfect features showing concern rather than anger. The great angel's resurrection had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. His wings now bore psychic scars that flickered with warp energy, and his eyes held depths of knowledge that came from witnessing what lay beyond death itself. "I question the wisdom of mercy toward those who have proven themselves irredeemable," the lion replied. "I have spent 50 years cleansing the Imperium Nihilus of chaos corruption. I have seen what our fallen brother's mercy looks like when inflicted upon loyal worlds. Entire sectors scoured of life, populations transformed into living plagues, civilizations driven mad by impossible geometries." Corvus Corax materialized more fully at the table's edge, his form shifting between solid flesh and writhing shadow. The Raven Lord's time in the Eye of Terror had transformed him into something that existed partially outside normal reality, and his perspective on their enemies carried weight that none could dismiss. "The lion speaks truly," Korax said, his voice seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "I have stalked our traitorous brothers through their domains, witnessed the depths of their corruption. They are no longer the sons Father raised. They have become extensions of the Chaos Gods themselves, avatars of primordial malevolence." He paused, his shadow form coiling with remembered fury. "But I have also seen something else. Beneath the demon flesh, beneath the accumulated corruption of 10 millennia, fragments of their original selves remain. Buried, twisted, nearly destroyed, but still there. Whether those fragments can be redeemed?" He shrugged, the gesture causing reality to ripple around him. "That remains to be seen." Ferrus Manus, his new form a perfect synthesis of flesh and blessed machinery, spoke with the resonance of forge hammers and precision gears. "Redemption is a process, not an event. The Omnissiah teaches us that even the most corrupted machine can be purified if one is willing to replace the tainted components." His liquid metal hands gestured with mechanical precision. "The question is whether our fallen brothers retained sufficient original architecture to support such purification." "Philosophy and theology," Rogel Dawn stated bluntly, his scarred face showing the same stoic determination that had defended Terra during the siege. "What matters is tactical reality. The traitors approach with forces that could shatter our defenses. Whether they can be redeemed is irrelevant if they succeed in their assault." The Imperial Fist Primarch's missing hand, lost during the Iron Cage incident, had been replaced by a sophisticated augmetic that incorporated archaeotech beyond current Imperial understanding. When he gestured with it, the mechanical fingers moved with precision that spoke of divine craftsmanship. "Our priority must be defense," Dawn continued. "The palace's fortifications, Terra's orbital defenses, the solar system's fleet deployments, all require coordination and unified command. We cannot afford the luxury of philosophical debate while enemy fleets mass beyond the Mandeville Point." "Spoken like someone who has spent 10,000 years hiding behind walls," a new voice interjected from the chamber's entrance. Every Primarch turned as Perturabo stepped into the council chamber, but this was not the demon Prince of Iron that their intelligence networks had reported. This Perturabo bore no mark of chaos corruption, no sign of the mechanical malevolence that had defined him for millennia. Instead, he appeared much as he had during the Great Crusade, massive, brilliant, and consumed by barely restrained fury at the universe's imperfections. "Brother," Gilliman said carefully, his hand moving toward the power sword at his side, "how do you come to be here? Our scrying showed you marshalling demon armies in the eye." "Your scrying showed what I chose to show," Perturabo replied, his voice carrying the weight of bitter satisfaction. "For 10,000 years, I have played the role of traitor while serving Father's deepest strategy. Did you truly believe the master of siege warfare would allow himself to be corrupted so easily?" The implications struck each Primarch simultaneously. If Perturabo had been loyal all along, if his apparent damnation had been an elaborate deception spanning 10 millennia, "The Iron Cage," Dawn breathed, his scarred features showing understanding and horror in equal measure. "You let me believe I had beaten you. Let me think your sacrifice was meaningless." "Your sacrifice was never meaningless, Rogel," Perturabo replied, something approaching warmth entering his voice. "But Father required one of his sons to appear fallen while remaining pure, someone who could infiltrate the traitor legions and report on their activities across the centuries. I drew the short straw." The Wolf King's nostrils flared as he scented something that defied analysis. "You reek of warp taint, brother. Whatever game you claim to play, you have touched the Empyrean's darkness. I have walked through hell itself to serve Father's plan, Perturabo agreed. I have pretended friendship with demon princes, coordinated with beings whose existence is antithetical to everything I believe. Do you think such deception comes without cost? Vulcan, who had remained silent throughout the heated exchange, finally spoke. His voice carried the warmth of forge fires and the patient wisdom of one who had died and returned multiple times. Brothers, we achieve nothing through recrimination. Whatever Perturabo's true allegiance, whatever strategies Father has employed without our knowledge, the fact remains that our enemies approach, and we must present a united front. United? Russ laughed, the sound carrying no humor whatsoever. Look around you, Vulcan. We have 8 Primarchs who cannot agree on basic tactical doctrine, one who may or may not be a traitor despite his protestations, and a command structure built on 50 years of compromises with bureaucrats and politicians. The Space Wolf gestured toward Guilliman with obvious contempt. Our brother has spent half a century learning to work within the Imperium's corrupt systems rather than cleansing them. He speaks of stability through compromise rather than justice through strength. Is this the vision for which we fought the Great Crusade? The Great Crusade failed, Guilliman snapped, his carefully controlled facade finally cracking. It failed because we were too rigid, too certain of our righteousness, too unwilling to adapt to changing circumstances. Everything I have done has been to prevent that failure from destroying us entirely. And in preventing one failure, you may have created another, Lionel Jonsson observed coldly. Tell me, Robert, how much of the Imperium's current structure serves humanity's interests, and how much serves the interests of those who have grown fat on its bureaucracy? Before Guilliman could respond, the chamber's Vox systems crackled with an emergency transmission. Lord Inquisitor Torquemada Cortez's voice filled the space, its tone carrying barely restrained panic. My lords, the Inquisitor's voice carried the weight of terrible urgency. We have a situation that requires immediate attention. The Inquisition's inner circle has divided on the question of the Primarch's return. Sanguinius leaned forward, his perfect features showing concern. Divided how, Lord Inquisitor? Approximately half of our number believe the simultaneous return of so many Primarchs represents the Emperor's manifest will and should be supported without question, Cortez replied. The other half considers it an impossibly coordinated chaos deception and has begun implementing exterminatus protocols against worlds that have declared celebration of your returns. The silence that followed could have been cut with a blade. If the Inquisition, the Imperium's ultimate defenders against heresy, was turning against itself over the Primarch's return, then the fractures ran deeper than any had imagined. How many worlds? Dawn asked, his voice carrying the terrible certainty of someone who already knew the answer would be unacceptable. 17 confirmed, my lord. Another 33 under investigation. The radicals believe that anything too good to be true must be a trap by definition. Corvus Corax's shadow form coiled with barely restrained fury. They're destroying loyal worlds because our return seems too beneficial to be real. Fear makes fools of even the wisest, Vulcan observed sadly. And after 10,000 years of fighting chaos corruption, perhaps it is understandable that some would see deception in even genuine salvation. But the damage was already done. Reports flooded in through the chapter's communication networks of Space Marine chapters receiving conflicting orders. Some commanded to prepare for the greatest celebration in Imperial history. Others warned that the returning Primarchs might be elaborate demon replacements designed to infiltrate the highest levels of Imperial command. The Blood Angels reported that 3 of their successor chapters had gone silent after receiving inquisitorial transmissions, their fate unknown. The Iron Hands indicated similar communications blackouts among their descendants. Even the Ultramarines, Guilliman's own gene sons, reported that some chapters were requesting genetic verification of their Primarch's authenticity. "This is what our father's grand plan has achieved," Leman Russ growled, his amber eyes blazing with fury. "Division where there should be unity, suspicion where there should be loyalty, brother fighting brother, while our true enemies prepare for the final assault." "The plan is not yet complete," Perturabo said quietly, his voice carrying certainties that none of the others possessed. "Father foresaw this division, these fractures. They are part of the process, not a failure of it." "Easy to say when you have apparently been privy to 10,000 years of secret knowledge," the lion replied acidly. "But for those of us who have served in ignorance, watching the Imperium tear itself apart over our return feels very much like failure." The council devolved into individual conversations and arguments, the unity that should have marked the loyal Primarch's reunion fracturing along lines of philosophy, strategy, and mistrust. Outside the chamber, their honor guards reported similar divisions among the gathered Space Marines. Warriors who should have been celebrating their gene sire's return instead found themselves questioning the nature of loyalty itself. Vulcan raised his voice, the sound carrying harmonics that made every other conversation cease. "Brothers, we have forgotten the most important truth. Whether we trust each other's methods, whether we approve of Father's strategies, whether we believe in the possibility of redemption for the fallen, none of that matters if we allow our divisions to hand victory to our enemies." He stood, his massive frame radiating the patient strength of molten rock, cooling into unbreakable stone. "We are Primarchs. We are the Emperor's sons. Whatever else we may be, politicians, warriors, idealists, pragmatists, we are family. And family does not abandon each other in the hour of greatest need." The chamber fell silent as each Primarch considered Vulcan's words. Outside, terror prepared for war, while the Imperium struggled with the implications of salvation offered after 10 millennia of suffering. The loyal sons of the Emperor faced their greatest test not on the battlefield, but in the council chamber, where unity should have reigned supreme. In the space between one breath and the next, the future of humanity balanced on the question of whether brotherhood could overcome the fractures that 10,000 years of separation had created. The answer would determine not just the outcome of the coming war, but the very nature of what the Imperium would become in its aftermath. The unity they needed was proving as elusive as the redemption their father sought to offer their fallen brothers. Chapter 7. The Missing Two. The deepest vault beneath the Imperial Palace had no name in any Imperial record, no designation in any databank, no mention in any chronicle. For 10,000 years, it had existed in a state of absolute secrecy, guarded by custodians who took vows of silence so binding that their vocal cords were surgically severed upon accepting their posts. But as the Emperor's psychic might reach unprecedented levels, ancient seals that had held since the Horus heresy began to crack. Captain General Trajan Valoris felt the disturbance through his enhanced senses, a tremor in reality that spoke of something fundamental changing in the palace's deepest foundations. The silent custodians who guarded the nameless vault had activated emergency protocols that had not been used since the vault's creation, their encrypted vox bursts carrying urgency that transcended their inability to speak. In the council chamber above, the 8 gathered Primarchs felt it too, a presence stirring that was both familiar and utterly alien, something that resonated with their gene-enhanced souls, but carried frequencies they could not identify. Perturabo, still defending his claims of hidden loyalty, paused mid-sentence as his enhanced senses detected disturbances in the palace's deepest architecture. "Something is awakening," Sanguinius said, his perfect features showing concern as his psychic abilities detected movement in spaces that should have contained nothing but stone and metal. Something that has slept for longer than our exile. The Emperor's psychic projection, maintaining its manifestation through the throne of bone's distributed power, turned its golden gaze toward the palace depths. For the first time since the gathering began, uncertainty flickered across the master of mankind's divine features. "It is time," he said, his mental voice carrying weight that made reality itself bend around the words. "The final gambit begins. My hidden sons, awaken." Deep in the nameless vault, stasis fields that had operated continuously for 10 millennia finally failed. 2 crystalline chambers, each large enough to contain a Primarch in full armor, cracked with sounds like reality breaking. Within each, a figure stirred. Beings who had been preserved not in death, but in a suspension so complete that time itself had passed them by. The first to awaken bore features that seemed familiar, yet impossible. A face that carried elements recognizable from each of the known Primarchs, as though he had been designed to be the perfect synthesis of all his brother's strengths. His armor was unlike anything in Imperial records, bearing no legion markings but inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. The second awakening figure was his complete opposite. Where the first was synthesis, this one was negation. His features were sharp where his brothers were balanced, angular where the other was harmonious. His armor was black as the void between stars, and the symbols upon it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As consciousness returned to beings who had been denied awareness for 10,000 years, both figures spoke simultaneously, their voices carrying harmonics that had not been heard since the Great Crusade itself. "Father calls," said the first, his voice a perfect blend of all his brother's tones. "The final hour arrives," said the second, his voice the antithesis of sound itself. They were the lost Primarchs, the 2nd and 11th, whose names had been stricken from all records, whose legions had been disbanded, whose very existence had become a whispered legend even among the Adeptus Astartes. But they had never been destroyed. They had been preserved, hidden, prepared for a purpose so secret that not even their brothers had known of their survival. In the council chamber above, every Primarch felt the awakening like a physical blow. Memories that had been sealed away by psychic barriers suddenly flooded back. Images of 2 brothers who had stood beside them during the Great Crusade, who had fought in battles that had been erased from history, who had been present at councils that officially never occurred. "Impossible," Guilliman whispered, his enhanced intellect struggling to process the implications. The 2nd and 11th were lost. Father himself declared them. "I declared them necessary." The Emperor's voice cut through his son's words. "When I foresaw the heresy's approach, when I realized that chaos would claim some of my sons, I knew that conventional tactics would not be enough to defeat an enemy that could corrupt my own children. I needed weapons that chaos couldn't understand, could not predict, could not corrupt." The vault's ancient mechanisms activated, conveying the 2 awakened Primarchs toward the palace's upper levels through transportation systems that existed in dimensions perpendicular to normal space. Within minutes, they stood before the great doors of the council chamber, their presence causing the adamantine barriers to resonate with frequencies that hurt to perceive. The doors opened without command, revealing the 2 lost Primarchs to their brothers for the first time in 10 millennia. The first to enter bore himself with dignity that spoke of absolute certainty in his purpose. When he spoke, introducing himself to brothers who had been made to forget his existence, his words carried truth that could not be denied. "I am Alpheus, the forgotten first, Primarch of the Second Legion. I am the synthesis of all our father's hopes, the amalgamation of every strength he sought to create in his sons. The second followed, his presence creating shadows that seemed deeper than mere absence of light. I am Omega, the lost last, Primarch of the 11th Legion. I am the negation of chaos's influence, the void that cannot be filled by corruption. The revelation struck the assembled Primarchs like a psychic thunderbolt. These were not merely two missing brothers, they were living weapons, designed specifically to counter the threat that chaos represented. Alpheus embodied every positive trait the Emperor had sought to instill in his sons, while Omega represented the complete absence of everything that chaos could exploit. The lost legions, Corvus Corax breathed, his shadow form coiling as suppressed memories fought their way to consciousness. I remember now. We fought beside them on... He paused, struggling with recollections that had been deliberately obscured. On worlds whose names were never recorded, against enemies whose existence was denied. The Great Hunt, Leman Russ added, his amber eyes blazing as memories long buried surfaced. We pursued something through the galactic core, something that threatened to unmake reality itself. The 2nd and 11th were there, were crucial to victory. Lion L. Johnson finished, his green eyes reflecting understanding and horror in equal measure. They were always the contingency plan. The weapons father would deploy only when all else failed. Alpheus nodded, his synthesized features showing compassion for his brother's confusion. We have spent 10,000 years in preparation for this moment. While you fought visible wars, our legions battled threats that exist between dimensions, entities that seek to corrupt reality from within. The unnamed enemy, Omega added, his voice carrying harmonics of absolute negation. The force that exists before chaos, that seeks to return existence to primordial entropy. We have held the line against their influence, while you fought the symptoms of their corruption. The implications were staggering. If the lost Primarchs had been fighting a war against threats that existed outside normal reality, if their legions had been operating in secret throughout the 10,000 years of the Imperium's existence. "Show us!" Ferrus Manus demanded, his mechanical components humming with frequencies that resonated with the hidden technologies the lost Primarchs carried. "Show us what you have been fighting, what you have learned." Alpheus raised his hand, and the chamber filled with holographic projections that defied every principle of Imperial technology. The images showed battles fought in dimensions that hurt to perceive, against entities whose very existence was antithetical to reality. Space Marines in armor, bearing no Legion markings, fought alongside figures that seemed to be living equations, mathematical concepts given form and purpose. The 2nd Legion became the Synthesis Guard, Alpheus explained, as the images shifted to show vast fortress monasteries hidden in the spaces between solar systems. We recruit not from single worlds, but from the moments between heartbeats, from the shadows cast by possibility itself. Our battle brothers are living expressions of perfect balance, incorruptible because they embody every virtue simultaneously. Omega's projection showed something even more disturbing. Vast fleets of black ships operating in the void between galaxies, crewed by space marines whose armor seemed to absorb reality itself. The 11th Legion became the Null Guard. We exist in the spaces that chaos cannot touch, the voids between thoughts where corruption finds no purchase. Our warriors are living nulls, beings who negate the very possibility of psychic influence. Rogel Dawn stepped forward, his scarred features showing the strategic mind that had defended Terra during the siege. How many of these hidden legions remain? Enough! Both lost Primarchs replied simultaneously, their combined voices creating harmonics that made reality itself take note. The Synthesis Guard numbers 100,000 battle brothers, each one a perfect balance of every Space Marine virtue. The Null Guard fields 50,000 warriors, each one a void in reality that chaos cannot fill. The mathematics alone was staggering. Together, the Hidden Legions represented a force larger than most of the known Space Marine chapters, and they had been operating in complete secrecy for 10,000 years. "Father," Guilliman said, turning to address the Emperor's psychic projection directly, "how much else have you hidden from us? How many other contingencies exist beyond our knowledge?" "Only what was necessary," the Emperor replied, his presence carrying certainties that brooked no argument. "The enemy we face has spent 10,000 years studying my loyal sons, learning your weaknesses, preparing counters to your strengths. But they have never encountered the lost. They cannot corrupt what they cannot perceive, cannot counter what they cannot understand." Vulcan, ever the peacemaker, stepped forward to embrace his newly revealed brothers. The moment his enhanced flesh touched theirs, energy discharges lit the chamber, as three different expressions of the Emperor's will recognized each other. "Welcome home, brothers. We have much to discuss." But the revelations were not finished. Across the galaxy, hidden fortress monasteries that had existed in the spaces between Imperial records suddenly revealed themselves. Worlds that appeared empty on every chart began transmitting identification codes that dated back to the Great Crusade itself. Space Marine chapters that had operated for millennia without official recognition stepped forward to acknowledge their true allegiances. On Macraga, ultramarine astropaths detected massive fleets translating from the warp in formations that followed no known tactical doctrine. The ships bore no Legion markings, but their silhouettes matched ancient designs that should have been extinct for millennia. In the Segmentum Solar, orbital monitoring stations registered the approach of vessels that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. Their crews broadcast authentication codes that made even the Custodian Guard stand down, despite having no record of those codes in any databank. The hidden war was revealing itself, and the scope of the Emperor's secret preparations defied even the most generous estimates of Imperial capability. The Lost Legions had not merely survived, they had thrived, growing into forces that could challenge the combined might of all known Space Marine chapters. "This changes everything," Lion L. Johnson said quietly, his strategic mind already calculating the implications for the coming war. "If Father has maintained hidden legions of this scale, if he has been fighting a secret war against threats we did not even know existed, then perhaps redemption for our fallen brothers is not the desperate gamble it appeared to be," Sanguinius finished, his perfect features showing hope tempered by understanding of the terrible costs such secrecy must have required. The Emperor's projection turned its golden gaze upon each of his sons, loyal and lost alike. "The final war begins now. My hidden sons have held the true enemy at bay, while you fought its symptoms. But the time for secrecy is past. Either we unite all our forces, visible and hidden, loyal and redeemed, or we face extinction, not just as an Imperium, but as a reality." In the space between one revelation and the next, the scope of the coming conflict expanded beyond anything previously imagined. The lost Primarchs had returned, bringing with them armies that existed outside normal reality and knowledge of enemies that threatened existence itself. The Emperor's ultimate gambit was finally revealed in its full scope, and even his loyal sons struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what their father had prepared for this final hour. The galaxy would never be the same, and in the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, seals that had protected even darker secrets, began to show the first hairline cracks that spoke of revelations yet to come. Chapter 8. Horus Reborn. The silence that followed the lost Primarch's revelation was shattered by something that defied every law of reality, mortality, and divine justice. In the heart of the Imperial Palace's most sacred chamber, where the Emperor's golden throne pulsed with the accumulated faith of 10,000 years, space itself began to tear. But this was not the chaotic rending that marked demon incursions or warp storms. This was precise, surgical, the work of a divine will so absolute that existence itself bent to accommodate its purpose. Golden light poured through the growing rift, carrying within it harmonics that spoke of resurrection, so profound it transcended even the impossible returns that had preceded it. The 10 gathered Primarchs, 8 loyal, 2 lost, now revealed, felt the disturbance simultaneously. But unlike the psychic resonance that had marked their brothers' awakenings, this carried a presence that struck them like a physical blow. Every enhanced heart in the chamber ceased beating for precisely 1 second as memories buried beneath 10 millennia of war and hatred suddenly blazed to the surface. "No," Sanguinius whispered, his perfect features showing horror that went beyond anything even death had taught him. "Father, you cannot mean to—" "I mean to complete what I began." The Emperor's voice cut through the angel's protest, carrying certainty that made the palace's foundations tremble. "All of my sons, all of them." From the golden rift stepped a figure that should not have existed, could not have existed, yet undeniably did. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, first among the Primarchs, beloved son and greatest traitor, walked into the council chamber with the steady gait of one who bore the weight of infinite guilt but refused to be crushed by it. He appeared much as he had during the Great Crusade's height, tall, powerful, radiating the natural authority that had made him the Emperor's chosen general. But there were differences that spoke of transformations more profound than mere resurrection. Where once his eyes had blazed with absolute confidence, now they held depths of sorrow that seemed to encompass every death his rebellion had caused. His armor bore no mark of chaos corruption, but neither did it carry the pristine glory of his former rank. Instead, it was simple, unadorned, the garb of a penitent rather than a conqueror. The reactions of his brothers were immediate and violent. Lionel Johnson's hand moved to his sword before conscious thought could intervene, the blade singing from its sheath with harmonics that spoke of 10,000 years of frustrated vengeance. "You!" he snarled, his voice carrying fury that had been carefully banked for millennia. "You dare show your face here? You dare stand in Father's presence after what you did?" Leman Russ's transformation was more dramatic, the Wolf King's careful humanity stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. His amber eyes blazed with killing light, and when he spoke, his voice carried the howl of Fenrisian winter storms. "I should have torn your throat out on Istvan, should have smelled the corruption festering in your soul before you poisoned our family." But it was Ferrus Manus who provided the most shocking response. The Iron Hand, newly returned from death and transformed by his fusion with the Omnissiah's will, stepped forward and embraced his once-beloved brother. The gesture sent shockwaves through the chamber. Ferrus, who had been slain by Fulgrim at Horus's command, offering forgiveness before any words were spoken. "Brother," Ferrus said simply, his voice carrying the resonance of forge hammers and precision gears. "I felt your anguish across the warp. I know what it cost you to return here, to face us with the weight of your sins undiminished." Horus's response was to sink to his knees, his massive frame trembling with emotion that no amount of genetic enhancement could suppress. "Ferrus, Sanguinius, all of you. I remember everything. Every world that burned because of my choices. Every loyal son who died screaming my name as a curse. I have no right to seek forgiveness, no right to stand in Father's presence again. Then why are you here? Corvus Corax demanded, his shadow form coiling with barely restrained fury. Why emerge from whatever hell spawned you to torment us with your presence? Before Horus could answer, the Emperor's psychic projection manifested more fully, its golden radiance filling the chamber with light that made even the Primarchs shield their eyes. When he spoke, his mental voice carried harmonics of love, disappointment, and absolute determination. "Because I willed it," the Emperor said simply. "Because the final war requires all of my sons, and that includes the one who fell furthest from grace. Because redemption, without the possibility of forgiveness, is merely another form of damnation." The implications struck the assembled Primarchs like thunderbolts. If the Emperor could resurrect Horus, if he could purge the War Master of chaos corruption while leaving his memories and guilt intact, then the scope of divine power they were witnessing transcended anything previously imagined. "The Chaos Gods," Guilliman said, his tactical mind immediately grasping the strategic implications. Their greatest champion, their most treasured victory, restored to our side. The psychological impact alone will shatter their remaining unity, Perturabo agreed, his strategic expertise automatically calculating the enemy's response. For 10,000 years, they have used Horus's fall as proof that even the Emperor's most beloved son could be corrupted. Now that proof becomes evidence of redemption's possibility, Alpheus, the Lost First, observed with his synthesized voice. The perfect counter to their propaganda of inevitable corruption. But Omega, the Lost Last, stepped forward with the negation that was his nature. Redemption requires acceptance, both from the redeemed and from those who offer forgiveness. Look around this chamber, brother. How many here can truly forgive what was done? The question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Sanguinius, who had died by Horus's hand during the Siege of Terra, stood silent, his perfect features showing internal struggle that defied easy resolution. Rogel Dawn's scarred face reflected the same conflict. The brother who had defended Terra against Horus's assault, now faced with the possibility of forgiveness. "I cannot," the lion said bluntly, his green eyes blazing with uncompromised fury. "I will fight beside you if Father commands it, but I will never forgive what you did to our family. Never." Leman Russ growled agreement, his predator's instincts rejecting the possibility of trust. "The wolf remembers every slight, every betrayal. You led our brothers to damnation, Horus, led them to become the monstrosities we now face. How many worlds have burned because of choices you made?" "Every world," Horus replied quietly, his voice carrying absolute acknowledgement of his guilt. "Every death in 10,000 years of war traces back to my moment of weakness. I do not ask for forgiveness, brothers. I know I have no right to it. I ask only for the chance to earn redemption through service in this final hour." Vulcan stepped forward, his perpetual nature giving him perspectives that transcended simple mortality. "And how do you propose to earn such redemption? What could possibly balance the scales of 10 millennia of suffering?" Horus raised his head, and for the first time since his resurrection, something approaching his old authority blazed in his eyes. "By doing what I was born to do, by leading my father's armies against the enemies of humanity. The 16th Legion's gene seed was preserved, hidden in the deepest vaults since the heresy's end. My sons can be reborn, purged of the corruption that claimed them, restored to their true purpose. The revelation sent shockwaves through Imperial intelligence networks that reached beyond Terra itself. Hidden gene repositories that had been guarded for 10,000 years by the most trusted custodians suddenly revealed their purpose. Thousands of vials of the 16th Legion genetic material, purified by techniques that bordered on miraculous, waited to birth a new generation of lunar wolves. But the implications went further than mere logistics. Across the galaxy, members of the Black Legion, the corrupted remnants of Horus's original force, felt their gene seed resonating with frequencies that should not have existed. Some fell to their knees in confusion, while others fled in terror from a sensation that spoke of their spiritual father's impossible return. On the bridge of the vengeful spirit, Abaddon the Despoiler felt the disturbance like a dagger through his heart. For 10,000 years, he had worn the title of War Master, claiming leadership of Horus's legacy. Now that legacy called to him across the void, with a voice he had thought silenced forever. "Impossible!" the Despoiler snarled, his talon of Horus crackling with energies born of frustrated rage. "The War Master is dead. I am the inheritor of his vision, the true heir to his purpose." But even as he spoke the words, doubt crept into his certainty. If Horus truly lived, if the father of the Black Legion had returned purged of corruption, then what did that make Abaddon himself? A usurper? A pretender? A traitor to his own gene sire? Similar scenes played out across every Chaos fleet as the implications of Horus's return propagated through the warp itself. The demon Primarchs, who had sensed disturbances for days, suddenly understood the magnitude of what their father was attempting. In Magnus's crystal fortress, the Crimson King felt reality shudder around him as the impossible became manifest. "He returns the arch-traitor to the fold," Magnus whispered, his single eye blazing with fury and something approaching admiration. "Father's arrogance knows no bounds. Does he truly believe that Horus can be trusted after what he did?" But even as he spoke, Magnus felt something stirring within his own corrupted soul, a fragment of his original self that had never truly accepted damnation, that had spent 10,000 years wondering if redemption might somehow still be possible. The effect rippled through all the traitor legions. Word-bearers who had preached the truth of chaos for millennia suddenly found their sermons interrupted by visions of the War Master reborn. Iron warriors questioned whether their eternal siege might finally have an end. Even the berserkers of the World Eaters felt something penetrate their endless rage, a memory of brotherhood that Khorne's blessing could not entirely suppress. On Terra, in the council chamber, where 10,000 years of family bonds faced their ultimate test, Horus slowly stood and faced his assembled brothers. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority that had once united the galaxy under the Imperial Eagle. "I know what I was," he said, his words carefully measured. "I was the favored son, the chosen heir, the one father trusted above all others. And I was the greatest failure in human history, the brother who chose damnation and dragged half our family into darkness with me." He paused, his gaze meeting each of his brothers in turn. "I remember every moment of my fall. I remember the whispers that seemed so reasonable, the promises that seemed so just. I remember the instant I chose personal ambition over family loyalty, and I remember every consequence that flowed from that choice." Sanguinius stepped forward, his perfect features showing the internal struggle of one who had died by his brother's hand, yet possessed a soul too noble for permanent hatred. "And now? What are you now, brother?" "I'm what I choose to be," Horus replied simply. "I am the War Master, returned to serve the Emperor of mankind. I am the brother seeking to undo 10,000 years of damage. I am the son who will face whatever punishment his actions have earned. The Emperor's projection blazed brighter, its presence filling the chamber with harmonics that spoke of forgiveness offered, but not demanded, of second chances that carried the weight of absolute consequences. "The choice is yours, my sons," the Master of Mankind said, his mental voice encompassing all present. "Horus returns because the final war requires his gifts, his knowledge of our enemy's nature, his understanding of how corruption spreads. But redemption is not a gift that can be imposed. It must be earned, and it must be accepted." Rogel Dawn spoke into the silence that followed, his scarred features showing the pragmatic calculation that had defined his entire existence. "Can we trust him in battle? Can we rely on his tactical expertise when the stakes are absolute?" "You trusted me once with the fate of the galaxy," Horus replied. "I betrayed that trust and paid the ultimate price. But I learned something in the space between life and death. In the realm where the Emperor's will reaches even fallen souls, I learned that trust must be earned anew, not assumed from past glories." Vulcan, ever the peacemaker, extended his massive hand toward his once beloved brother. "Then let it be earned, Horus. Let the redemption our father offers be proved through deeds rather than words." As the Salamander's Primarch and the returned War Master clasped hands, energy discharges filled the chamber with light that spoke of brotherhood, tested beyond all limits, but not entirely broken. The gesture was witnessed by custodians who would carry its memory for eternity, by silent sisters whose null fields could not entirely suppress the hope that blazed from the reunion. The Emperor's ultimate gambit was nearly complete. All his sons, loyal, lost, and redeemed, stood ready for the final war. But even as they prepared for the battle that would determine the galaxy's fate, each knew that the greatest victory would not be won against external enemies. It would be won in the space between forgiveness and trust, between redemption sought and redemption accepted, between the brother who had fallen and the family that might, just might, be willing to let him rise again. The War Master had returned, and with him came the possibility that even the deepest wounds inflicted by family could ultimately heal. Whether that possibility would survive the trials ahead remained to be seen, but for the first time in 10,000 years, hope burned brighter than hatred in the hearts of the Emperor's sons. Chapter 9. The siege begins. The first blow fell not as a single strike, but as a symphony of destruction orchestrated across a dozen star systems simultaneously. The traitor Primarchs had learned patience during their 10,000-year exile, and when they finally moved, they did so with coordination that made their original rebellion seem like a chaotic rampage by comparison. In the strategium of the Imperial Palace, tactical displays that had shown stable green for decades suddenly erupted in cascades of red warning indicators. Astropathic choirs screamed warnings that arrived too late to matter, their psychic voices carrying terror that transcended mere military intelligence. The enemy had not simply attacked, they had manifested across the galaxy with surgical precision, striking at the Imperium's most vital organs with simultaneity that defied conventional military doctrine. "Mars is under assault," Captain General Valoris reported, his golden features showing strain as he processed intelligence that arrived faster than human cognition could pass. "Perturabo has translated an entire fleet directly into the Martian orbital sphere. The Fabricator General reports massive demon engines materializing within the forge complexes themselves." Robert Gilliman's enhanced mind immediately grasped the implications. Without Mars, the Imperium's capacity to produce advanced weaponry would collapse within months. The Mechanicus might survive the loss of individual Forge worlds, but Mars was the heart of their entire civilization, the repository of technologies that dated back to the Dark Age itself. Mortarian's plague fleets have emerged at the edge of the Sol system, continued Valoris, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of a warrior who had witnessed the impossible becoming routine. Long-range auguries indicate viral bombardment capabilities that could sterilize Terra's atmosphere within days if they reach orbit. The Primarchs gathered in the council chamber felt the weight of 10,000 years of preparation crystallizing into a moment of absolute crisis. Their enemies had chosen their targets with devastating precision: Mars to cripple Imperial technology, Terra to destroy Imperial command, and according to the reports flooding in from across the galaxy, strategic worlds whose loss would fragment the Imperium's ability to coordinate resistance. Baal, Sanguinius whispered, his perfect features showing pain that went beyond the physical as astropathic reports reached him from his home world. Angron manifests in the Baal system with a fleet of brass ships that burn with Khorne's fury. My sons face the Red Angel's wrath without warning. The great angel's wings spread wide, each feather crackling with psychic energy as his enhanced senses reached across the void to touch the minds of his gene sons. What he found there made even his post-resurrection calm fracture. The Blood Angels were fighting with desperate courage, but they faced an enemy whose fury transcended anything they had encountered since the heresy itself. Lionel Johnson stepped forward, his strategic mind already calculating the terrible mathematics of the situation. They force us to divide our strength. We cannot defend all targets simultaneously with the forces we have available. That is their intention, Perturabo agreed, his voice carrying bitter admiration for the enemy's tactical brilliance. Force the defenders to spread thin, then overwhelm individual positions with concentrated force. It is siege warfare on a galactic scale. But even as they spoke, more reports flooded in. Magnus the Red had manifested above Titan, his sorcerous might warring with the Grey Knight's most sacred fortress monastery. Fulgrim's forces had translated into the Ultramar system, threatening Macragge itself with corruption that could unweave reality. Across a dozen sectors, Imperial worlds found themselves facing enemies whose very presence violated the laws of nature. The coordination is perfect, Corvus Corax observed, his shadow form coiling as he processed intelligence that arrived through channels both mundane and supernatural. They knew exactly when to strike, exactly where our forces were positioned. This level of intelligence— He paused, his transformed nature allowing him to perceive patterns that eluded normal analysis. The Alpha Legion. As if summoned by his words, emergency klaxons began sounding throughout the Imperial Palace. In corridors that had been secure for 10 millennia, explosions erupted with precision that spoke of intimate knowledge of the palace's architecture. Custodian guard who had stood sentinel for centuries found themselves facing enemies who emerged from alcoves that should have contained only ceremonial artifacts. Internal breach, Captain General Valoris voxed, his auramite armor already singing with the harmonics of active combat. Alpha Legion forces have been embedded within the palace structure. They move with knowledge that suggests decades of reconnaissance. The implications struck the assembled Primarchs like physical blows. If the Alpha Legion had infiltrated the Imperial Palace itself, if they had been operating under their very noses throughout the reunion. Alfarius, Horus said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of strategic experience. He always preferred the indirect approach. While we focused on his brother's obvious preparations, he positioned his pieces for maximum psychological impact. Indeed, across Terra, Astra Militarum regiments that had served loyally for generations suddenly turned their weapons on each other. Naval officers who had commanded Imperial vessels for decades activated scuttling charges that crippled entire battle groups. Even among the Space Marine chapters, brotherhood bonds that had endured for millennia shattered as Gene sons found themselves facing brothers whose loyalty had been carefully compromised over centuries of patient infiltration. "We must move," Guilliman declared, his tactical mind cutting through the chaos to focus on essential priorities. Mars cannot fall. Without the Mechanicus, we lose our technological edge permanently. "Ball requires immediate reinforcement," Sanguinius countered, his noble features showing anguish that went beyond strategic concerns. "My sons face annihilation without support. Terra's defenses hold priority above all else," Rogel Dawn stated, with the absolute certainty that had defined his entire existence. If the throne world falls, nothing else matters. The Emperor's psychic projection blazed brighter, its presence filling the chamber with golden radiance that carried the weight of divine command. But when he spoke, his mental voice carried not commands, but terrible certainty. "This is the moment for which we prepared. My sons must divide to meet the threat, but they will not fight alone. The hidden legions, the preserved gene lines, the weapons cached across the galaxy, all were prepared for this hour." Ancient systems that had remained dormant throughout the palace suddenly activated. Teleportarium arrays that could transport entire companies across interstellar distances began cycling to operational status. Weapons vaults that had not opened since the heresy disgorged armaments that made current Imperial technology seem primitive by comparison. "Ferris," the Emperor's voice continued, "take your iron hands to Mars. Your synthesis of flesh and machine makes you uniquely suited to counter Perturabo's daemon engines. Sanguinius, fly to Baal. Your sons need their father's presence to stand against Angron's fury. Guilliman, coordinate the defense of Terra while managing strategic deployments across all fronts." Each assignment carried the weight of absolute necessity, but also the terrible knowledge that even Primarch-level intervention might not be sufficient against enemies who had spent 10 millennia perfecting their hatred. Ferrus Manus nodded, his mechanical components already interfacing with the palace's logistics networks. "The 10th Legion's successors converge on the Sol system as we speak. Combined with the hidden Forge ships, we can match Perturabo's numbers. But the demon engines—" He paused, his enhanced senses detecting disturbances in the warp that spoke of technologies that violated natural law. "They operate on principles that merge chaos energy with mechanical function. Defeating them will require innovations that push our understanding beyond current limits." Sanguinius spread his magnificent wings, each feather crackling with psychic energy that spoke of powers enhanced by his passage through death itself. "The Blood Angels and their successors number in the hundreds of thousands across the galaxy. But Angron—" The great angel's perfect features showed concern that went beyond tactical analysis. "He is no longer the brother we remember. Corne's blessing has transformed him into living fury given form. Conventional tactics will not suffice." As the Primarchs prepared for deployment, reports continued flooding in from across the galaxy. The scale of the coordinated assault defied comprehension. Entire sectors found themselves fighting for survival, as chaos forces emerged from hidden positions with timing that spoke of preparation spanning centuries. On Cadia, the fortress world that had held the Eye of Terror in check for 10,000 years, massive demon incursions began manifesting with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of the planet's defensive systems. Lord Castellan Creed's successor found himself fighting a war on 17 fronts simultaneously, His legendary tactical acumen stretched beyond all reasonable limits. In the Ultramar system, Fulgrim's forces brought corruption that transcended the merely physical. Entire populations found themselves transformed by sensations that rewrote their neural architecture, while Imperial Guard regiments discovered that their very weapons had been compromised by Alpha Legion sabotage, spanning decades. But perhaps most disturbing were the reports from the Eastern Fringe, where Tau Empire forces found themselves fighting alongside Imperial Guard units against Chaos incursions that threatened both civilizations. The enmity between human and Xenos seemed insignificant when faced with entities whose very existence threatened the continued possibility of rational thought. "The coordination is flawless," Perturabo observed with professional admiration that transcended his personal loyalties. Each strike calculated for maximum strategic impact, timed to prevent mutual support between defending forces. It is siege warfare elevated to an art form. Lionel Johnson's green eyes blazed with fury that had been carefully banked for 10 millennia. Then we respond in kind. Coordinated, simultaneous, overwhelming force applied where they least expect it. "The Lost Legions," Alpheus said, his synthesized voice carrying certainties that transcended normal tactical doctrine. "The Synthesis Guard and Null Guard have spent 10,000 years preparing for this moment. They can strike at targets the enemy cannot predict, because they do not know of our existence." Omega nodded, his negation nature allowing him to perceive patterns that eluded normal analysis. The spaces between their coordination, the gaps in their omniscience, that is where victory lies. As the greatest military minds in human history coordinated humanity's response to its ultimate crisis, one truth became inescapably clear. The final war had begun, not with a single climactic battle, but with a campaign whose scope encompassed the entire galaxy. Each Primarch would face trials that would test not only their military genius, but their fundamental nature as beings poised between mortality and divinity. Each would command forces numbered in the millions, while bearing responsibility for the survival of their individual gene lines. But perhaps most crucially, each would face enemies who knew them intimately, who had studied their weaknesses, prepared counters to their strengths, and crafted strategies specifically designed to exploit the bonds of brotherhood that both strengthened and constrained them. The siege had begun, and when it ended, either the Imperium would emerge purified and victorious, or the galaxy would burn in fires that would make the Horus Heresy seem like a minor skirmish by comparison. In the space between one strategic decision and the next, 10,000 years of preparation met 10,000 years of hatred, and the universe held its breath to see which would prove stronger when everything was finally at stake. The Emperor's sons went to war, and with them went the fate of every soul in the galaxy. Chapter 10. Brothers' War Eternal. Across the galaxy, where gods wearing the faces of brothers met in combat, reality itself began to buckle under the weight of conflicts that transcended mere warfare. These were not battles in any conventional sense. They were cosmic events, clashes between beings whose very existence shaped the fundamental nature of space and time around them. On Mars, where the red sands had been stained by 10,000 years of industrial toil, Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim faced each other across a battlefield that had once been the greatest forge complex in human space. But this was not the doomed confrontation of Istvan Fefi, where betrayal and surprise had given the demon prince his victory. This time, both brothers came to their reunion with full knowledge of what they had become, what they had lost, and what the stakes of their conflict truly represented. Fulgrim manifested in his full demonic glory, his serpentine form writhing through dimensions that normal matter could not touch. 4 arms moved in impossible harmonies, each wielding weapons that existed partially in the warp, their edges singing with frequencies that could slice through reality itself. The Phoenician had spent 10,000 years perfecting his fusion with Slanesh's gifts, becoming something that transcended the crude limitations of physical existence. But Ferrus Manus was no longer the brother who had died on Istvan. His resurrection had not merely restored him, it had transformed him into something that represented the perfect synthesis of flesh and machine, organic life enhanced by divine technology until the distinction between biological and mechanical became meaningless. His famous liquid metal hands now extended throughout his entire form, creating patterns of silver and gold that pulsed with energies drawn from the Omnissiah itself. "My dear Ferrus," Fulgrim purred, his voice carrying harmonics that made the forge complex's surviving machinery scream in resonant agony. "How perfectly you embody the weakness you once despised. More machine than man, more artifact than living being. Have you finally accepted that the flesh truly is weak?" "I have learned something you never could, brother," Ferrus replied, his voice carrying the resonance of every forge hammer that had ever shaped metal into purpose. "The flesh is not weak because it is flesh. It is weak when it lacks direction, when it serves only itself rather than a higher purpose. You chose to serve sensation and self-gratification. I chose to serve creation and perfection." Their first clash sent shockwaves through the Martian crust that registered on seismographs across 3 continents. Where Fulgrim's blades met Ferrus's enhanced form, reality bled colors that had no names, and the very air crystallized into geometric patterns that hurt to perceive. The iron hands who witnessed their gene sire's battle wept coolant fluid from their augmetic eyes, seeing in his transformed state the fulfillment of every doctrine they had followed for 10 millennia. Their father had achieved true unity between flesh and machine, becoming a living expression of the Omnissiah's will made manifest. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Prospero, not the world that Magnus had destroyed in his folly, but the new Prospero he had built within the Eye of Terror, Leman Russ hunted his ancient prey through crystal spires that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. The Wolf King had changed during his time in the Eye, his predator nature refined by 10,000 years of hunting through nightmares, but his fury at Magnus's betrayal burned as hot as ever. Magnus the Red manifested in his full sorcerous might, his cyclopean form wreathed in flames that burned without heat, casting shadows that showed the future as clearly as the past. The Crimson King had spent millennia mastering arts that transcended mortal understanding, becoming a living nexus of psychic energy that could rewrite reality with a gesture. "Still the ignorant barbarian," Magnus observed, as Russ stalked him through corridors that folded in on themselves like geometric prayers. 10,000 years to learn wisdom, and you remain as crude and direct as ever. Tell me, brother, have you finally realized that knowledge is the only true power?" "I learned something in the Eye, Magnus," Russ growled, his amber eyes reflecting depths that no mortal mind should contain. "I learned to hunt things that don't exist, to track prey through dreams and nightmares. And I learned that all your knowledge, all your sorcery, all your understanding means nothing if you lack the will to use it correctly." The Wolf King's assault came not as brute force, but as something far more dangerous. Tactical brilliance, refined by 10 millennia of impossible hunts, predatory instincts elevated to cosmic awareness. Where Magnus expected crude violence, he found surgical precision. Where he anticipated mindless rage, he encountered calculated fury that struck at weaknesses in his defenses that he hadn't known existed. Their battle raged across Prospero's crystal towers, each exchange of blow and counterblow reshaping the fundamental architecture of the demon world. Where Russ's claws struck, reality reasserted its primacy over sorcerous illusion. Where Magnus's spells manifested, the very laws of physics bent to accommodate impossible geometries. But perhaps the most emotionally complex confrontation occurred in the void between Baal and its moons, where Sanguinius and Horus fought not as enemies, but as allies against the fury of Angron. The Red Angel had manifested as a titan of brass and blood, his demonic wings casting shadows that screamed with the voices of every soul slain in Khorne's name. But where the great angel faced his ancient nemesis, he did so with his redeemed brother at his side. "Together again," Sanguinius said to Horus as they coordinated their assault against their fallen brother, their combined presence creating harmonics of nobility and redemption that made Angron's rage burn even brighter. "As we should have been at the siege." "As we will be at the end," Horus replied, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of guilt transformed into determination. "But first, we must reach whatever remains of our brother beneath Khorne's corruption." Angron's response was wordless fury, a roar that shattered 3 of Baal's moons and sent shockwaves through the warp itself. The World Eater had become pure aggression given form. But beneath the daemon's rage, fragments of the gladiator who had once fought for freedom still flickered. The battle was unlike anything in recorded history. 3 Primarchs locked in combat, while their fleets engaged in void warfare that painted nebulae in colors drawn from their gene-sires' souls. Where Angron's fury met Sanguinius's nobility, stars themselves paused in their courses. Where Horus's tactical genius guided their combined assault, space-time bent to accommodate strategies that operated on scales beyond mortal comprehension. On Caliban, or rather, the fragment of Caliban that existed within the Eye of Terror, preserved by Luther's millennia of guilt and hope, Lionel Jonsson faced not his fallen mentor, but the living embodiment of every choice that had led to the Dark Angel's shame. Luther had long since transcended mortality, becoming a psychic construct powered by the Legion's collective need for redemption. "My lord," Luther spoke, his voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years of regret. "I have waited so long for you to come home, to finally face what we made of our brotherhood." "What I made," the lion replied, his green eyes blazing with self-recrimination that had been carefully banked for millennia. "My pride, my secrecy, my inability to trust even those closest to me. I created the conditions that allowed chaos to poison our home." Their confrontation was more than physical combat. It was an exercise in redemption, a working through of guilt and forgiveness that had to occur before the lion could face his true enemies with a pure heart. Each exchange of blows carried decades of unspoken grievances. Each parry represented forgiveness offered and accepted. In the deepest reaches of the Eye of Terror, where Lorgar had built his cathedral world of Sikaris into a monument to chaos undivided, Corvus Corax moved through shadows that existed between thoughts. The Raven Lord had become something that transcended physical existence, a living concept of vengeance and justice that could manifest wherever shadows fell. Lorgar felt his approach like pressure against the soul, the word-bearer's enhanced senses detecting movement in dimensions that should not have been accessible to any being still anchored to sanity. The Primarch of the 17th Legion had spent 10,000 years becoming the ultimate expression of faith, perverted into its darkest form. But even his absolute certainty wavered when faced with his brother's transformed nature. Corvus, Lorgar whispered into the darkness that gathered around him, his voice carrying harmonics of prayer and blasphemy intertwined. Have you come to complete the hunt you began so long ago? I have come to offer you a choice, Corax replied, his voice seeming to emerge from every shadow simultaneously. Redemption or retribution. Father's mercy or my justice. Choose wisely, brother. This may be your last chance to choose at all. Their battle raged through the cathedral spaces of Sycharis, faith and justice clashing in ways that made reality itself question its own certainty. Where Lorgar's sermons met Corax's silence, where corruption encountered purity, the very foundations of chaos doctrine began to crack, and across all these conflicts, Vulcan moved like a force of nature given purpose. His perpetual nature allowed him to take risks that would destroy any other being, to throw himself into situations where death was not just likely, but inevitable, secure in the knowledge that he would return to continue the fight. On 17 different worlds, the Salamander's Primarch died protecting innocents from demonic incursion, only to resurrect moments later with fury that burned brighter than forge fires. His presence became a rallying point for Imperial forces across the galaxy. Wherever the battle seemed lost, wherever hope failed, there Vulcan would manifest, his massive form wreathed in flames that cleansed rather than consumed. His hammer struck blows that echoed across star systems, each impact sending shockwaves through both physical reality and the warp itself. But the true measure of the conflict's scope became apparent when orbital monitors detected gravitational anomalies that suggested the battles themselves were affecting the fabric of space-time. Where Primarchs clashed, local reality became malleable, subject to their collective will rather than universal constants. On Mars, the confrontation between Ferrus and Fulgrim had created zones where time flowed backward, where machinery evolved beyond its original design without external input. The Forge World's remaining tech priests spoke in hushed binary hymns of witnessing the birth of new physical laws. Around Prospero, the duel between Russ and Magnus had generated psychic storms that manifested as literal weather patterns, raining crystallized knowledge that drove mortals mad with understanding. Entire Imperial fleets had to retreat to safe distances as reality storms swept through the system. Near Baal, the three-way battle had created gravitational distortions that pulled asteroids from neighboring systems, creating impromptu weapons that the combatants hurled at each other with casual disregard for orbital mechanics. The Blood Angels watching from their fortress monastery reported that their father's wings now cast shadows that showed possible futures, each feather reflecting different outcomes of the greater war. As the conflicts raged, one truth became inescapably clear: the galaxy could not sustain warfare on this scale for extended periods. Where gods battled, worlds died. Where Primarchs unleashed their full might, star systems reshaped themselves around the conflict. The confrontations that had begun as strategic necessities were becoming existential threats to reality itself. In the depths of the Imperial Palace, the Emperor's consciousness stretched across the galaxy to monitor each battle simultaneously. His golden presence touched the minds of his loyal sons, offering guidance, strength, and the terrible certainty that these conflicts would determine not just the war's outcome, but the future nature of existence itself. My sons, his mental voice reached each combatant across impossible distances. Remember what you fight for. Not just victory, but redemption. Not just survival, but transformation. Each blow you strike shapes the galaxy that will emerge from this crucible. The brothers' war eternal had begun, and when it ended, either the universe would be remade in the image of nobility and sacrifice, or it would burn in fires that would make the Horus heresy seem like a gentle warming compared to the conflagration that would consume all hope. In the space between one cosmic blow and the next, 10,000 years of carefully nurtured hatred met 10,000 years of equally careful hope, and the galaxy trembled to learn which would prove stronger when everything was finally at stake. The Primarchs fought as gods, and like gods, their battles would reshape the very nature of the reality they sought to preserve or destroy. Chapter 11. Unity of Purpose. The turning point came not with grand proclamations or strategic revelations, but with a single act of selfless courage that proved redemption could transcend even the deepest wounds carved by betrayal. In the void above Baal, where 3 Primarchs had battled among the debris of shattered moons, Angron's demonic fury had reached a crescendo that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of local space-time. The Red Angel's rage had grown beyond mere emotion, becoming a fundamental force that rewrote reality around him. His brass wings spread across light years, each feather a blade that could sever the bonds between atoms themselves. Sanguinius fought with the nobility that had defined him since his first breath, but even his post-resurrection powers were insufficient against a brother who had become the living embodiment of Khorne's infinite wrath. The great angel's perfect features showed strain as he parried blows that carried the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated fury. It was then that Angron's axe, Gorefather, broke through Sanguinius's guard, its demon-forged edge aimed directly at the angel's heart, a killing blow that would have repeated the tragedy of the Siege of Terra, ending the great angel's second life as brutally as his first. But the blow never landed. Horus Lupercal, the War Master redeemed, threw himself between his brothers with speed that transcended physical possibility. Gorefather's edge, meant for Sanguinius's noble heart, instead carved through Horus's chest, the demon weapon drinking deeply of the blood that had once flowed with the blessing of all 4 Chaos gods. "Brother," Horus gasped, golden ichor streaming from wounds that would have killed any lesser being. Remember who you were before the nails. Remember Nuceria. Remember why you fought." For one impossible moment, Angron's fury hesitated. Through the Red Angel's brass features, something flickered. A memory of a gladiator who had fought not for glory or bloodshed, but to free his fellow slaves. A brother who had wept when the Emperor had denied him the chance to die beside his comrades. "Horus!" Angron's voice carried harmonics that shattered 3 Imperial ships, but beneath the demon's roar lay something almost human. You saved him. You saved Sanguinius." The implications rippled through the warp itself. Horus Lupercal, who had struck down the great angel in their timeline's darkest hour, had now sacrificed himself to preserve his brother's life. The redemption that had seemed theoretical, political, strategic, suddenly became viscerally real. Across the galaxy, where other battles raged between the Emperor's sons, every combatant felt the psychic shockwave of that moment. On Mars, Fulgrim's perfect features showed something approaching genuine emotion as he sensed his former ally's transformation. On Prospero, Magnus's single eye blazed with understanding that transcended mere knowledge. But it was Perturabo who provided the most shocking response. The Iron Warrior, who had spent 10 millennia pretending loyalty to Chaos while serving his father's deepest plans, finally revealed the true scope of his deception. "Enough!" Perturabo's voice carried across 17 star systems simultaneously, his form blazing with power that made his brother demon princes recoil in shock. 10,000 years of this charade. 10,000 years of pretending brotherhood with beings who represent everything I despise. The Lord of Iron manifested his true nature, Not the demon prince he had appeared to be, but something far more dangerous. A loyalist Primarch who had been given 10 millennia to study chaos from within, to learn its weaknesses, to prepare for this exact moment. His fortress world of Medrengard, which chaos forces had believed to be their greatest stronghold, suddenly revealed its true purpose. Every siege engine, every demon-forged weapon, every architectural impossibility had been designed not to serve the dark gods, but to destroy them. With a single command code that dated back to the Great Crusade, Perturabo turned the entire eye of Terra's greatest military asset against its former masters. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for Chaos forces. Demon princes, who had thought themselves unassailable, found their forms destabilizing, as weapons specifically designed to disrupt warp entities tore through their formations. The Iron Warriors Legion, every member of whom had been secretly purged and replaced with loyalists over the course of millennia, revealed their true allegiance with precisely coordinated strikes against their supposed allies. But Perturabo's revelation was only the beginning. Across the galaxy, other shocking transformations began manifesting. Jagatai Khan, who had been battling chaos forces in the webway, emerged with an entourage that made the Dark Eldar themselves bow in respect. The Master of the White Scars had spent 10,000 years not merely hunting their raiders, but forging alliances with Eldar factions who shared his hatred of chaos. The Eldari remember the war in heaven, the Khan announced, as his forces joined the Imperial assault on multiple fronts. They have waited 65 million years for a chance to strike back at the entities that devoured their gods. They stand with us now, not as allies of convenience, but as brothers in arms against the true enemy. The implications were staggering. If the Eldar, humanity's most sophisticated enemies, were willing to ally with the Imperium against chaos, then the scope of the threat transcended anything previously imagined. It was then that Alpheus and Omega, the lost Primarchs, finally revealed the secret knowledge they had preserved through 10 millennia of hidden warfare. "Brothers," Alpheus spoke, his synthesized voice carrying certainties that made reality itself take note. "The demon princes can be destroyed permanently, not merely banished. But it requires a unity of purpose that we have never achieved. All 18 loyal Primarchs, acting in perfect coordination, their combined will channeled through Father's divine essence. Omega's negation nature allowed him to perceive the fundamental structure of chaos itself. The dark gods draw their power from discord, from the divisions between us, our hatred of each other, our mistrust, our separate ambitions, all of these feed their strength. But unity, true unity, that is anathema to everything they represent." The revelation struck every Primarch simultaneously. Their father's plan had never been simply to defeat chaos militarily. It had been to forge a unity so complete, so absolute, that the very concept of discord would become impossible in their presence. One by one, the redeemed began revealing themselves. Magnus the Red, whose psychic might had been the Chaos God's greatest prize, manifested in the Sol system not as an enemy, but as a brother seeking absolution. His single eye blazed with power that had been carefully hidden for millennia, the strength to undo every spell he had cast in service to Zinch, to unweave every lie he had helped to spread. "I have spent 10,000 years learning to master the very forces that once enslaved me," Magnus announced to his gathered brothers. "Every spell cast in the Crimson King's name, every ritual performed to serve the Changer of Ways, all were preparations for this moment, when I would turn that accumulated power against its source." Mortarion followed, his presence no longer carrying the stench of corruption, but the clean scent of purification itself. The Death Lord had not been serving Nurgle for 10 millennia. He had been infiltrating the Plague God's realm, learning the fundamental nature of disease and decay so that he could create their perfect antithesis. Life and death are part of the same cycle, Mortarion declared, as his presence began healing the very wounds that chaos had inflicted upon reality. I have learned to command both, to make death serve life rather than entropy. The grandfather's gifts become tools of resurrection rather than decay. Even Angron, his rage finally tempered by the shock of seeing Horus's sacrifice, began to remember what he had been before the butcher's nails had been hammered into his skull. The gladiator who had fought for freedom, not bloodshed. The brother who had wept for fallen comrades rather than glorying in their deaths. The nails, Angron whispered, his massive hands reaching toward his skull where the archaic devices still pulsed with malevolent purpose. Father, can you? The Emperor's psychic projection manifested more fully than it had since the heresy itself, his presence blazing with power that made the Astronomicon seem like a candle by comparison. But now, instead of bearing that power alone, he had the willing souls of his sons to channel it through. 18 Primarchs, united not by force or manipulation, but by genuine understanding of their purpose. My son, the Emperor's voice, carried compassion that 10,000 years of pain could not diminish. The nails were never truly the source of your rage. They were merely an excuse to embrace what you thought was your nature. But you are my son, created to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down. Let me show you who you truly are. The psychic surgery that followed transcended anything in Imperial medical doctrine. Where the Emperor's will touched Angron's tortured consciousness, 10,000 years of artificially induced rage began to drain away like poison from a lance. The butcher's nails, which no technology had been able to remove, simply dissolved under the weight of divine compassion, backed by filial love. For the first time since his youth on Nuceria, Angron wept tears of joy rather than fury. The unity that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had witnessed since the Great Crusade's brightest days. 18 Primarchs stood together in the Imperial Palace's great council chamber, their combined presence creating harmonics that reached across space and time to touch every human soul in the galaxy. But this was not the naive unity of the Crusade's early days, built on conquest and the assumption of easy victory. This was unity forged in the crucible of betrayal, tested by 10,000 years of war, and tempered by the knowledge of what failure would cost. Each brother knew the other's weaknesses, their flaws, their capacity for both nobility and corruption, and each chose brotherhood anyway. The final phase, Robert Guilliman said, his strategic mind already calculating what 18 united Primarchs could accomplish. Father, your plan reaches its culmination. Indeed, the Emperor replied, his presence now blazing with power that made the Golden Throne's mechanisms sing with harmonics of perfect function. My sons, you have learned what I hoped you would, that true strength comes not from individual glory, but from willing sacrifice for something greater than yourself. The coordination that followed defied every principle of conventional military doctrine. 18 different strategic geniuses, each with their own areas of expertise, their own tactical preferences, their own approaches to warfare, somehow found perfect synchronization. The lost Primarchs provided knowledge of fighting entities that existed outside normal reality. The redeemed brought intimate understanding of Chaos's true weaknesses. The Loyalists offered 10,000 years of experience in holding the line against impossible odds. Space Marine legions that had not fought together since the heresy began converging on strategic positions across the galaxy. But these were not the same formations that had marched during the Great Crusade. Each legion had been transformed by its experiences, refined by millennia of warfare, enhanced by technologies and techniques that transcended anything the Imperium had previously achieved. The Blood Angels arrived at their designated coordinates with wings of their own, their mastery of aerial combat having evolved beyond anything in Imperial doctrine. The Iron Hands manifested with war machines that existed partially in both the material realm and the warp, their fusion of flesh and blessed metal having reached levels that made them living prayers to the Omnissiah. Most shocking of all, the reconstituted lunar wolves took the field under Horus's direct command, their gene seed purified by techniques that transformed the very nature of their existence. Where once they had been the spear tip of rebellion, they now became the instrument of redemption, each battle brother carrying the weight of their Primarch's guilt transformed into determination. The Emperor's presence expanded beyond the confines of the Golden Throne, his consciousness touching every loyal soul across the galaxy simultaneously. But instead of bearing that vast psychic load alone, he distributed it among his willing sons, creating a network of divine will that could coordinate actions across galactic distances with perfect precision. "The time has come," the Master of Mankind announced, his mental voice reaching every corner of Imperial space. "Not merely to defeat our enemies, but to transform the very nature of existence itself. My sons, together, we will show the galaxy what humanity can become when it chooses unity over discord, sacrifice over selfishness, love over hatred." The final assault was not merely military. It was metaphysical, an attack on the fundamental concepts that allowed chaos to exist. 18 united Primarchs, their combined will channeled through divine purpose, preparing to challenge gods themselves. In the space between one coordinated heartbeat and the next, the Emperor's ultimate gambit reached culmination. His sons stood ready not just to fight for humanity's survival, but to redefine what survival itself could mean. The unity they had achieved would either usher in a golden age that surpassed even the Great Crusade's brightest dreams, or it would burn in fires that would consume the very possibility of hope. But for the first time in 10,000 years, the Emperor's sons faced the future as true brothers, and that brotherhood was about to reshape the galaxy itself. Chapter 12. The Final Gambit. The moment had come for which 10,000 years of war, suffering, and sacrifice had been mere preparation. In the space above Terra, where the Emperor's will had first reached out to touch the stars, reality itself began to reshape around a confrontation that would determine not just the galaxy's fate, but the fundamental nature of existence itself. For the first time since the Golden Throne had claimed him, the Emperor of Mankind stood. His physical manifestation was sustained not by archaeotech or the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers daily, but by the willing devotion of 18 united sons, whose combined psychic might, channeled through bonds of brotherhood that transcended even death itself. Golden radiance blazed from his towering form with intensity that made stars seem dim by comparison. But this was not the cold light of distant divinity. It was the warm illumination of a father who had never stopped loving his children, even those who had fallen into darkness. Around him, the 18 loyal Primarchs stood in perfect formation, their individual auras creating harmonics that rewrote the laws of physics within their immediate vicinity. Each bore the accumulated weight of 10 millennia of warfare, but also the transformative power of redemption willingly chosen and brotherhood consciously embraced. But they did not stand alone. From the deepest reaches of the warp came the remaining forces of chaos, led by those demon Primarchs who had refused the offer of redemption, who had chosen eternal hatred over the possibility of forgiveness. Fulgrim manifested in his full, serpentine glory, his forearms wielding weapons that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Lorgar Aurelian blazed with the corrupted faith of 10 billion worlds, his presence a dark mirror of his father's divine radiance. Most terrible of all was Alpharius, or perhaps Omegon, for with the Alpha Legion, certainty itself became a weapon to be wielded. The 20th Primarch appeared not as a single being, but as a hydra of possibility, each head representing a different outcome, a different timeline where chaos had achieved ultimate victory. "Father," Fulgrim spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that made reality bleed at the edges. "You offer redemption to those who have transcended the need for your forgiveness. We have become gods in our own right, powers that rival your own. What can you offer us that we have not already claimed?" The Emperor's response came not in words, but in demonstration. His presence expanded beyond the merely physical, touching the minds of every sentient being in the galaxy simultaneously. But instead of crushing weight or overwhelming force, each consciousness felt the simple truth of unconditional love. Not love that ignored their flaws, but love that saw through them to the potential that lay beneath. "I offer you the chance to remember who you were before you chose to become what you are," the master of mankind replied, his mental voice carrying harmonics that made even the chaos gods themselves pause in their eternal machinations. "I offer you the opportunity to choose again, with full knowledge of where each path leads." The battle that followed transcended every definition of conflict previously imagined. It raged simultaneously across real space and the warp, in the past and future, through dimensions that existed only in the spaces between thoughts. Where the Emperor's light met chaos corruption, fundamental constants of reality became negotiable suggestions. Sanguinius faced Fulgrim in aerial combat that painted nebulae in impossible colors, their conflict a dance of perfection against corruption that made entire star systems pause in their orbits to witness. The great angel's nobility met the Phoenicians' perverted beauty in clashes that created new forms of mathematics with each exchange of blows. Ferrus Manus and his brother met again, but this time their confrontation was more than personal. It was a war between two competing visions of perfection. Fulgrim's sensory excess clashed against Ferrus's synthesis of flesh and blessed machinery, each strike creating technologies that existed for nanoseconds before reality collapsed under their impossibility. Horus stood before Lorgar, the redeemed facing the corrupted, brotherhood confronting perverted faith. Their battle was fought not with weapons, but with words that carried the weight of absolute truth, each speaking visions of what humanity could become. Where their convictions met, entire worlds found themselves transformed, not through conquest or corruption, but through the simple power of belief made manifest. But the true test came when the chaos gods themselves were forced to manifest directly, their vast consciousnesses taking physical form to preserve their remaining champions. Khorne appeared as a mountain of brass and fury whose footsteps cracked continents. Tzeentch manifested as a crystalline maze that existed in all possible configurations simultaneously. Nurgle took shape as a garden of decay, whose very presence made entropy itself more efficient. Slaanesh became a symphony of sensation that threatened to overwhelm every sense that had ever evolved. The Emperor met them not as an enemy seeking to destroy, but as a creator, confronting flawed aspects of his original design. For the truth that blazed from his divine presence made itself known. The Chaos Gods were not alien invaders, but fragments of humanity's own psyche, reflections of mortal emotion that had been allowed to grow beyond all proportion in the warp's timeless realm. "You are my responsibility," the Emperor declared, his words carrying the weight of absolute acceptance. "Created by my children's pain, given form by their despair, sustained by their hatred. But you are also capable of transformation, just as they are." The confrontation that followed reshaped the fundamental nature of the warp itself. Where divine compassion met primordial fury, new emotions began to crystallize. Courage that transcended mere absence of fear, love that encompassed even one's enemies, hope that could survive any despair. Each Primarch faced their ultimate test in that cosmic moment. Vulcan found himself choosing between his perpetual nature and the chance to grant true peace to every soul who had ever suffered. Corvus Corax confronted the possibility of laying down his vengeance and choosing forgiveness for even the most unforgivable crimes. Lionel Johnson faced the temptation to maintain his secrets, his careful control, his distrust of others' motives. One by one, they chose brotherhood over power, unity over control, love over fear. The lost Primarchs revealed the final secret they had preserved through 10 millennia of hidden warfare, the knowledge of how to transform the Chaos Gods themselves, not by destroying them, but by completing the evolution they had begun. Alpheus and Omega worked in perfect synthesis, creation and negation, combining to offer the dark powers the same choice their Primarch champions had been given: transformation or stagnation. Reality became malleable as the battle reached proportions that made the war in heaven seem like a minor skirmish. Galaxies served as weapons, time itself became a battlefield, and the fundamental forces that held existence together strained under the weight of possibilities unleashed. But the outcome hinged not on power or strategy or divine intervention. It hinged on a simple question that each consciousness present, mortal and immortal, loyal and corrupted, divine and demonic, had to answer. Was brotherhood stronger than hatred? The answer came from the most unexpected source: Alpharius, or Omegon, the hydra of possibility that had seemed the most irredeemably corrupted, suddenly collapsed into a single form. Not the demon prince he had appeared to be, but a brother who had spent 10,000 years carrying out the most complex deception in galactic history, allowing himself to appear as Chaos's ultimate weapon while preserving the knowledge that would make their final defeat possible. "Hydra Dominatus," he whispered, but this time the words carried their original meaning. Not "the Hydra dominates," but "through the Hydra, unity." The Alpha Legion's true purpose was finally revealed: to preserve the possibility of redemption even in the hearts of those who seemed most lost. The psychological shock of this final revelation shattered the remaining bonds that held the Daemon Primarchs to their corrupted nature. Faced with the knowledge that even the most complex deception had ultimately served love rather than hatred, even the most corrupted souls found fragments of their original selves stirring to life. Fulgrim fell to his knees, his serpentine form dissolving to reveal the brother who had once wept for the beauty of art rather than seeking to corrupt it. Lorgar's fanatical certainty cracked, replaced by the humility of a seeker who had finally found the truth he had always claimed to serve. The Chaos Gods themselves faced the ultimate choice: continue their eternal war, their endless corruption of mortal emotions, their futile rebellion against the Creator who had never stopped loving them, or accept transformation into what they had always had the potential to become. Khorne's brass mountain cracked, revealing not mindless fury, but righteous anger that sought to protect rather than destroy. Tzeentch's crystal maze straightened into paths that led to genuine knowledge rather than endless deception. Nurgle's garden of decay blossomed into cycles of death and rebirth that served life rather than entropy. Slanesh's overwhelming sensation refined itself into appreciation of beauty that elevated rather than corrupted. The galaxy that emerged from this cosmic transformation bore little resemblance to the war-torn realm that had existed before. Worlds that had been scoured lifeless began showing signs of regeneration beyond anything previously imagined. Species that had been enemies for millions of years found themselves capable of cooperation in the face of challenges that transcended their ancient grudges. The Imperium itself was transformed, no longer a grim necessity for survival, but a willing fellowship of worlds united by shared purpose rather than enforced compliance. Space Marine legions that had been separated for 10 millennia found themselves working together on projects that would have been considered impossible during the Great Crusade's height. But perhaps the greatest change was in the Emperor himself. No longer bound to the Golden Throne by necessity, no longer forced to bear the crushing weight of humanity's survival alone, he walked among his children as both father and equal. The God Emperor who had been distant and terrible became simply a being of infinite love who had finally achieved his greatest dream, a family reunited and a galaxy at peace. The Primarchs, all 20 now restored to their true nature, spread across the galaxy not as conquerors, but as gardeners, nurturing the growth of civilizations that combined the best aspects of every species they encountered. Each brought their unique gifts to challenges that spanned not just worlds, but entire sectors of space. Horus, his redemption complete, became the herald of new possibilities, the living proof that no fall was too far to climb back from. Sanguinius taught the transformation of sorrow into joy, showing that even death could serve life if approached with proper understanding. Ferrus Manus bridged the gap between organic and mechanical life, creating symbioses that elevated both. The lost Primarchs emerged from their hidden war to reveal technologies and allies that had been preserved in secret. Not just the hidden legions, but entire civilizations that had chosen to remain hidden until the galaxy was ready for their gifts. But the new age was not without its challenges. Freedom brought choices, and choices brought the possibility of new mistakes. The price of unity was eternal vigilance, not against external enemies, but against the temptation to fragment once more into competing factions. Yet for the first time in galactic history, those challenges were met not with war and suffering, but with genuine cooperation between beings who had learned that their differences were sources of strength rather than division. As the Emperor stood in the palace gardens that had once been the epicenter of 10,000 years of grinding war, surrounded by sons who had chosen brotherhood over power, allies who had chosen cooperation over conquest, and peoples who had chosen hope over despair, he smiled. The gambit had succeeded beyond even his most optimistic projections. The galaxy had not merely survived its greatest crisis, it had been transformed by it, made into something greater than the sum of its parts. In the space between one peaceful moment and the next, a new age began. An age shaped not by the choices of 20 Primarchs alone, but by the choices of every consciousness that had learned to choose love over fear, unity over division, brotherhood over the simple satisfaction of being right. The Emperor's greatest work was complete, and it was good. The war was over. The peace was just beginning. And in that peace, infinite possibilities stretched toward a future that held not just survival, but genuine flourishing for every soul in the galaxy. The final gambit had become the ultimate victory, and the galaxy would never be the same.